This is Sarah Osgood, Executive Director of the Climate Action Council. It's great to see everyone here again today. It's my pleasure to kick off another meeting of the Climate Action Council. We've chosen to hold today's meeting via webinar as a matter of safety, as well as to enable broader participation from across the state. And if I can now hand it back to Farah Anderson to walk us through the procedures for today's meeting before we dive into the roll call and agenda.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. So to that end, we wanted to essentially cover today that since the meeting is once again virtual, many of the procedures that have been shared in the past, wanted to just hit upon them again to ensure another smooth and productive meeting. So to briefly remind council members of our logistics, the first is to remain mute if you're not speaking, so we can limit background noise. The next is to ensure that you are joining on video if possible. We will ensure that we're also monitoring and are helping that ensure that others are muted if we do hear from you. Sorry, did someone say something there? All right. To continue with the meeting procedures, noting that if you do want to ask a question or provide your thoughts, please use the raise your hand function, which has the hand icon on your screen to indicate that you'd like to speak. You can click on the panelist participant button in that sort of red box with the 3 dots if you want to access that function. And when you're called, please go ahead and unmute yourself and then go back on mute following making your comment or question. We do anticipate roll call votes today and can hope for a smooth logistics component of that process. So we will call on members in alphabetical order and ask you to place your vote saying aye or no. And then lastly, if you have any direct questions on tech and need support, feel free to email us directly at nys.cac@cadmusgroup.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. So let's turn to calling roll call to see which members of the council are in attendance today. If I could ask NYSERDA's Valerie Milanovic, if you could call the members, and members, if you are here, please say here as your name is called.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you hear me?
You're slightly faint, but I can hear you.
Okay, I'll try to speak up. Okay. Commissioner Sagos?
I'm here. Good afternoon.
President Harris?
Good afternoon.
Commissioner Ball?
Good afternoon.
Donna DeCarolis?
Here. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Commissioner Dominguez? Gavin Donahue?
Here.
Dennis Elsenbeck?
Here.
CEO Falcone?
Here.
On behalf of Empire State Development, Vince Ravatier?
Here.
Rose Harvey? On behalf of Chair Howard, Commissioner Majore?
Here.
Bob Howarth?
I'm present, thank you.
Peter Aronowitz?
I'm here.
Chancellor Malatras?
Here.
CEO Quinones?
Here, present.
Commissioner Reardon?
Here.
Ann Reynolds?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
On behalf of Secretary Rosado, Sarah Crowell?
Here.
Raya Salter?
Here, thank you.
Paul Shepson?
Here.
Commissioner Visnauskas?
Here.
On behalf of Commissioner Zucker, Henry Splito?
I'm here, thank you.
Great. Given that, Council co-chairs, I note the presence of a quorum for today's Climate Action Council meeting.
Great. Thank you, Val. So you all see the agenda in front of you. We'll start with a consideration of the minutes from the last meeting. Jordan and I will share some brief remarks. Been a busy few months. And then we're going to get some very important feedback from the Climate Justice Working Group on the advisory panel recommendations from Ag and Forestry, as well as land use and local government. And then we'll dive into some more of the analytical work being conducted to support all of our decision-making on the draft scoping plan, as well as the integration analysis. So let's move to the minutes. Hope you all had a chance to review that. Is there any discussion of the minutes from the July 22nd meeting? Okay. Hearing none, seeing none, can we move to approve? Can I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second,
Second.
all in favor, say aye.
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 Anyone opposed, say no. Motion carries. Thank you, unanimously. Next slide, please. So usually we take a few minutes just to orient the council in the beginning here, talk about what's been going on in the last few months. Certainly top of mind for us has been the transition in Albany, significant as it is, with the resignation of the former governor, Andrew Cuomo, and very tumultuous few months as it has been, and particularly challenging, of course, for the women who had the courage to take a stand and demand accountability. My hope, I think I speak for all of us, all of our hopes, is that this will lead to some positive change and some manner of healing for the state. On that, August 24th was a significant day with the ascension of Kathy Hochul to the governor's office, the first woman in that position, which is fantastic on all fronts. I know that she's more than ready for this job. I've spent quite a bit of time with her over the last number of years. Very optimistic. She gets our work. She understands the importance of it, and I hope all of you will join me in reaching out to her and engaging with her as we certainly go through our work as a council. So that is this slide. Next slide, please. Climate change, that's what we're talking about. The IPCC report certainly painted this is the first of the sixth assessment report. Very stark in its warnings, finding the clear link between climate change and human activity, but also determining in many ways that strong and sustained actions on greenhouse gas emissions has the chance to limit climate change. So it's very important. We're obviously digging through this report, all of us here, all the agencies involved here. I hope you all are as well. It is relevant to everything that we're doing. At the next meeting, we're going to dig into the report a bit more and discuss some of the key findings as we see them and have more of an open discussion about it. Next slide, please. As if to underscore the report, this has been a particularly brutal summer, really internationally, when it comes to severe weather and the effects of climate change, and the clear linkages being made between our changing climate and the weather that we experience in our communities. You just look no further than New York, what we've gone through with Fred, Henri, and Ida, three storms that have just brutalized the state. I'm sure many of you have lived through that directly. Those of you downstate who lived through the flooding in New York City, and those of you in the southern tier, of course, and elsewhere on some of these other storms. Clearly also underscoring a need for us to focus on racial equality, on the disproportionate impacts being borne by historically disadvantaged communities. That's where you saw some of the worst impacts, certainly, of these storms and the flooding, and of course elsewhere in the country, the same conditions. Realizing that we're only talking about New York here, but certainly we are part of a global crisis, and we have to recognize that. Next slide, please. So we'll obviously get into the main parts of the agenda in a moment. Just some brief milestones on the governor's ascension. Really, it was her second day on the job. She met with EPA Administrator Michael Regan, which I thought was a wonderful beginning to her tenure, prioritizing climate and environment right off the bat. I know that will continue as we head into Climate Week next week. Last week, the governor helped us cement our leadership position nationally on the transition to clean transportation. First, by requiring the transition to 100% sales of zero-emission vehicles by 2035. That's for new vehicles by 2035, and 100% sales of zero-emission trucks and buses by 2045. And of course, has directed DEC to prepare some of that rulemaking that will jumpstart the transition starting as early as model year 25. So we're already at work hard on that right now. Doreen.
Yes, good afternoon to everyone, and happy to be with you all today. For sure. We certainly have had a number of other recent highlights to cover, so I'll just hit a few of these quickly, given the agenda that we have. But starting from the most recent, many of you hopefully saw last week that the Public Service Commission acted to consider and approve the Clean Energy Fund petition that we at NYSERDA had developed and filed late last year as part of the fund's planned triennial review. Certainly a complex portfolio, but it was great to see the work advance through that order, and notably to focus our work on the priorities of the CLCPA, most notably the goal of 40% of benefits to disadvantaged communities. So I know we don't have Chair Howard here today, but Commissioner Majori, certainly thank you for moving that forward on behalf of NYSERDA and of the state at large. Next up, we did launch a $6 million Climate Justice Fellowship program recently, open and seeking applications from host employers to support the professional development, training, and mentorship of full-time fellows who live in disadvantaged communities or are from priority population. And in fact, what's so exciting about this is not only is that characteristic necessary to apply, but the projects themselves must be focused in those communities as well. So we are very excited to get that program off the ground, and it's demonstrable of the work that we intend to be advancing broadly. We also participated in 2 initiatives. Certainly, we like to think of them as bureaucracy busting because they represent partnerships first with NYC HPD to significantly streamline the funding of electrification activities in affordable housing. This announcement alone is expected to support approximately 1,200 living units and benefit 3,000 low to moderate income residents. And a similar announcement was with our counterparts at Homes and Community Renewal, where we collaborated together to advance $7.5 million in funding toward a pilot effort to drive all electric, efficient, affordable homes, targeting 600 homes under this initial effort. And this was part of HCR's summer 2021 multifamily finance RFP. And we're excited to introduce this integrated and streamlined assistance for affordable housing rehabilitation projects starting in 2022. So Commissioner Visnauskas, thank you for your partnership in that respect. And then finally, back in early August, we launched a $5 million program in technical assistance support funding for communities, specifically to support power plant site reuse planning studies for localities that host aging fossil fuel units. This was work launched by the Just Transition Working Group, and we're excited to provide these resources to these communities directly to help them proactively plan for their future. So that rounds out our quick summary of recent highlights. Certainly more to come, as you indicated as we head through September for sure. But back to you, Basil, for our next agenda item.
Thank you, Doreen. Next slide, please. Welcome back to the members of the Climate Justice Working Group. Good to have you here. Just a quick shout out at the beginning to one of the members of the working group, Elizabeth, who just lost her mother, and all of us extend our hearts to you. I'm not sure if she's on today, but we saw that news recently. So the Climate Justice Working Group, again, we've received really important feedback from the group already on the transportation, housing and energy efficiency, and power gen advisory panels. And today we're moving into agriculture, as I mentioned earlier, agriculture and forestry, and then land use and local government. So we'll dive into that in a moment. Certainly after we get through this meeting, we intend to further communicate on a regular basis, more expanded dialogue with the working group on the input to the scoping plan as this comes together in the next few months. So again, I want to thank them for all their hard work. They've been working extraordinary hours behind the scenes, and we're grateful for that. So now I will turn over to, I believe, not sure who's kicking it off. Who's kicking it off from the group?
I think that's me. This is Sonal from We Act.
Oh, hey, Sonal. Okay, great. Please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Commissioner. We're happy to be here again today, and we appreciate the time that we've been getting on the Climate Action Council from our group, and for being able to provide these recommendations orally, as well as what will be and what already is written recommendations for everyone to review. So we really appreciate it. Thank you. I just want to start before getting into the recommendations. I'll be giving some of them and then passing it off to my other working group members. Just 2 disclaimers. One is we are unfortunately not joined by a number of our working group members today. And so we're all representing comments that we've all agreed on together. But in terms of answering questions, we'd appreciate if we could just have written questions that we then get to respond to as a group consensus, since we don't have that today. And then the second disclaimer, or just doubling down on our ask to hear back from the Climate Action Council and the other advisory panels on the recommendations and comments we have given. We were lucky to be joined by Sarah and our a couple working group meetings ago, and had a discussion about how we're hearing back from you all in terms of how you're digesting the information that we're giving. We find that to be really important and want this to be a bi-directional relationship. So we really appreciate that as well. So I'm going to begin by talking about taking on a couple parts of the land use panel recommendations. So yes, thank you very much. So the first piece is adaptation and resilience, and I'll say overall for land use, the working group found that this was generally a really well done set of recommendations, and we're overarchingly found that we're pretty happy with it. I would say overall, there are some recommendations and desires for some more, I guess, specificity is a good way to put it when it comes to some of the thoughts on land use. So for adaptation and resilience, starting with the state resilience officer that was written about and pointed in this panel, we just want to ensure that it's not only just appointed by the governor, but it's the officer appointed is very aware of just transition efforts. So we think it should be really specific in terms of who's appointed, and then also we would like there to be consultation and approval by the Climate Justice Working Group, or the Future Environmental Justice Advisory Group. And we would also like some clarity on where the Adaptation and Resilience Sub-Cabinet would reside in government. The next piece is that we support the creation of resilient infrastructure fund through bonding, but it should have a specific focus on frontline communities, carve out for frontline communities. The next piece is a feeling that there could be a potential problematic unintended consequences of the surcharge on insurance premiums for select lines of insurance, which are affected by climate hazards that generate revenue to support for risk reduction and adaptation projects. Then the next piece is asking for clarity on the strategy to address persistent underinsurance by surveying the amount of and types of coverage purchased by homeowners and developing strategies for increasing take-up rates of flood insurance and other coverage. The concern is that if a rebate for homeowners is introduced, it could work well, but if the policy is requiring homeowners to buy insurance without providing support, it could be unintentionally problematic for disadvantaged communities. The next piece is a consistent climate projections. They should be explicitly used across state agencies. SECRA, for example, needs to be updated to reflect and require the use of NYSERDA's Climate 2.0 climate change projections in the review of all projects. There needs to also be greater understanding of the impact of DAC's frontline communities when it comes to the managed retreat analysis that's in here. The other concern or just need to flesh out better is the ongoing analysis of local long-term health impacts of extreme temperatures, which is starting to be done a lot in New York City. And we're wondering if there's more discussion about the build out of that on a statewide capacity, since we know that's extreme temperatures are only getting worse and there's a lot of health implications of that. The heat warning system, in connection to that, we support that strategy, but it should also take into consideration air quality, and it should be supporting our air quality monitoring that's being rolled out at a lot bigger way through the CLCPA. We believe that there should be the strategy to enhance and leverage the New York State Weatherization Assistance Program, providing the opportunity to deepen indoor comfort for extreme heat, extreme conditions, is great and should be combined with solar. The next piece is around providing incentives for improved private forest management, including afforestation, reforestation, and minimal or no harvest areas where appropriate. That there should be direct funding to build and maintain nature-based infrastructure in natural areas, with additional strategies for shoreline ecosystems, services, and urban forest. And the DOS coastal management program should be updated to require the reduction of truck traffic in working waterfront in and around EJ areas, where barging, rail, and alternative vehicles can be used to improve air quality and reduce emissions. So there's a couple more items on the slide, but that's kind of the overarching number of comments from that. Adaptation and resilience. The next piece, you can go to the next slide. Yes, is on the other land use pieces. The land use recommendations focus on new commercial and residential development, which is good for suburban areas, but there is an effect of gentrification displacement that it can have on DACs. And so we're wondering about the consideration for that and how that's being prevented. Smart growth and its definition shouldn't be limited to include planning and implementation of new commercial and residential development, but also should include various types of mixed use planning and development. And it should include the investment of technical and financial resources for climate justice and environmental issues in DACs. And that smart growth solutions are very different for suburban, urban, and rural communities. The definition of priority development and conservation areas also require careful consideration. As smart growth is fostered in priority development and conservation areas, degrowth of higher climate risk or ecologically sensitive areas doesn't lead to negative socioeconomic impacts for DACs. And so we want to ensure a just transition and adequate municipal support for resiliency for the residents in areas that are in climate risk. There is a suggested language for the definition of priority development and priority conservation areas that are DOS designated planning areas to focus on CLCPA funding in order to achieve the highest expected impacts while balancing results across the mitigation goals, adaptation needs, accruing benefits for disadvantaged communities, and just transition priorities as defined by climate justice and just transition working groups. We think that members of DHC should be engaged in planning and implementation of projects in their communities. And the process needs to be community-centered visions, and that needs to be prioritized. There needs to be strategies to prioritize investments in higher density areas that can't accommodate TOD, but require immediate attention. And the recommendations focus on new commercial and residential development and TOD, but there's a missed opportunity for open spaces and recreational areas as part of that consideration discussion. It's also important to, around the smart growth, to make sure that DACs are protected from the unintended consequences. And how are we doing that? Such as investing in transit in suburban areas at the expense of high density areas that still don't have the adequate transit that they're needed. And what does that mean in terms of longer commutes, for example? A couple other pieces, that there should be consideration of explicit land use strategies to prioritize CLCPA investments and not just increasing density or development, and that the strategy should be responding to the mandate of greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants in disadvantaged communities. The next piece is that the regional economic development councils, the governance structure and appointment process of them need to be reformed and include diverse representation from DACs, because they're going to be highly affected in those decisions. And there is a proposal to consider the creation of a new climate justice through community planning and action grant to fund local capacity building and DACs to encourage more participation in project planning and review processes. And this program could also fund implementation of land use plans created by DACs to achieve the CLCPA reduction goals. The last piece I'll mention is I'll be presenting on is the clean energy pieces. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So we're supportive of local climate action via the adoption of New York State solar permit and other local actions to streamline permitting processes for better clean energy technologies, including energy storage. We're supportive of the development of microgrids that are municipal, that are schools, that are private, and district clean energy systems, specifically as they're powered by renewables and storage. We're supportive of expanding workforce development programs focused on training and job placement in emerging technologies and clean energy. We're supportive of promoting community scale campaigns to encourage adoption of new innovative technologies to generate value and savings for customers, again, specifically those zero emissions technologies. We are supportive of the facilitation and promotion of deployment of clean energy to expand equitable access, maximizing local economic benefit and resiliency, and minimizing environmental impacts through planning support, provision, model local laws, streamlined permitting and local development regulations that clearly identify appropriate as of right installation opportunities for different clean energy technology types, and clear requirements and reasonable process for installations that are not as of right. And those are kind of direct pieces taken from the clean energy recommendations in the land use panel. The other things we're supportive of is efforts to increase the clean energy and energy efficiency upgrades for municipally owned buildings. We think that's a huge opportunity that's pretty clear for facilitation. That developing tools and resources, including mapping, to help municipalities undertake comprehensive evaluation of the potential for clean energy development in their communities, and to plan proactively for deployment that maximizes local benefit and minimizes impacts on lands with high quality soils and other competing uses. The other pieces we support are the technical support to help governments and public entities develop these projects, to provide some financial support for local governments to plan for and review solar projects, for evaluating options to reduce the interconnection costs for municipally owned priority sites. We also agree that NYPA should play a larger role in supporting the development of renewables in partnership with local governments and in support of disadvantaged communities. I think that's a big piece. And then on CCA, community choice aggregation, it is a great tool for consumers to connect and purchase their energy However, these goals need to be reached by considering how to remove barriers to entry, particularly for low-income households, and safeguards for energy burden households that have been the target of previous predatory practices. We're also very supportive of the electrification of municipal and school district fleets while increasing the fleet-wide fuel economy. And we're supportive of increasing the waste reduction and recycling rates in municipal operations and the community. So those are other pieces that were directly taken from the land use recommendations that we're supportive of. And I believe that's the end of our recommendations for the clean energy. So I'm going to pass it on to Jared to talk about the next piece.
Yeah, thank you, Sonal, and thank you, council members, for your time and attention this afternoon. My name is Jared Bly. I'm with the Adirondack North Country Association, and I'll finish up the land use and local government slide, and then I'll transition over to the ag and forestry and start us off there. So generally, we are supportive of living shorelines to enhance ecosystem services and a greater focus on natural and nature-based infrastructure to protect climate vulnerable communities, with a greater focus on prioritization of disadvantaged communities. We are supportive of the recommendation to, quote, increase New York State and other investment in the protection, restoration, and monitoring of freshwater, non-tidal wetlands and adjacent areas, including riparian areas, to maximize carbon sequestration potential. And this, for example, is Environmental Bond Act and the Environmental Protection Fund, grants like DC's Water Quality Improvement Program and New York State Conservation Partnership Program. We do support the recommendations around the use of natural and nature-based solutions to enhance resilience and ecosystem benefits. And finally, we're supportive of enhancing the carbon sequestration potential of natural areas across New York State by conservation planning, local government, and landowner assistance and stewardship. Next slide, please. So this is some of our overall impressions for the ag and forestry recommendations. The advisory panel's recommendations provide a suite of policies to achieve a 30% cut in ag emissions, but the CLCPA requires elimination of all anthropogenic emissions from the ag sector, except for livestock emissions. In addition to this overemphasis on voluntary incentive programs, a lack of necessary regulatory measures, and inclusion of inadequate solutions to meet the scale of the problem, including biogas and biomass, among others. In addition, the recommendations fail to fully address organic farming, support equity and investments with an emphasis away from large-scale farms, end the use of fracked gas and nitrogen fertilizers, incentivize natural over synthetic fertilizers, and address systemic racism in New York's agricultural sector. Next slide, please. As the Climate Action Council's scoping plan addresses the agricultural sector, it must not utilize solutions focused solely on carbon counting. We must consider the impact of our food and agricultural system on communities, human and ecological, just as we have by planning for an equity-focused, just transition away from fossil fuels. This means addressing together the issues of agriculture's contribution to climate change, agriculture's reliance on harmful chemical use, the impacts of nutrient pollution, the impacts of fertilizer and pesticide manufacturing on frontline communities, the lack of diversity in New York's agriculture, the treatment of farm workers, and the harm industrial agriculture does to nearsighted communities and to our land, water, and air. Farmers and ranchers have already begun the transition away from industrial practices that are detrimental to the ecosystem. BIPOC farmers have developed and utilized sustainable agricultural practices for centuries and already know how to use the agroecological practices to fit farms into the land they inhabit, and that must recognize traditional and ancestral knowledge in this space. Farmers around the country are adopting soil health practices that reduce emissions, sequester carbon, and improve yields. We also have many programs already in place to speed the transition. We are thus more than ready to ramp up the transition to more diversified regional ecological production. A 2019 case study provided by the American Farmland Trust in Genesee Valley, New York, found that many advantages of better soil management and use of strip till, cover crops, and nutrient management, including the reduction of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment losses by 40, 92, and 96% respectively, and a 560% reduction in total greenhouse gas emissions, which corresponds to taking 3 cars off the road. The farming practices supported by the Watershed Agricultural Council and New York City by offering grants and loans to protect the quality of drinking water in the Catskill watershed are the same strategies that would help us reduce our impact on our climate and make our farms more resilient. Funding for riparian buffers, fencing for rotational grazing, and no-till practices sequester carbon and protect drinking water. The methods also help prevent erosion and damage from extreme weather events, making farms more prepared to readjust. If public funding were available for small farmers to make these transitions and put them into practice, it could help reduce the toxic algal blooms occurring in the Finger Lakes and other areas threatening drinking water supplies from multiple small cities. Reducing our use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides has a direct result in reducing demand for fracked gas, but also help our natural pollinators recover from the devastating population decline. In New York State, we have a new soil health bill, the Soil Health and Climate Resilience Act, that will be signed into law, and multiple existing state and federal programs to start a comprehensive of our agriculture. Next slide, please. New York State should follow key principles in developing equitable policies to reduce greenhouse gases from the agricultural sector. New York State should ensure that policies to address climate change do not increase and indeed decrease the use of harmful toxic pesticides. Farm workers and communities living near agricultural areas are on the front lines of pesticide exposure and related illness. Farm workers in our nation are predominantly people of color, 68%, and half are undocumented immigrants, and about 20 are migrants, according to USDA's Economic Research Service Department. Addressing climate change must go hand in hand with moving away from chemical-intensive farming, as the production of pesticides and fertilizers is itself a greenhouse gas intensive process. This is particularly salient given the harmful impacts pesticides have on healthy soils, and that the panel is focusing its GHG mitigation efforts on. New York State should ensure that policies do not create disproportionate barriers for small to mid-sized farmers and for socially disadvantaged farmers. Incentive programs may not reach these farmers without intentionality to ensure that they can access benefits. Things like paperwork, monitoring, and reporting requirements are important, but can be a greater burden for small farmers and socially disadvantaged farmers. The state can do this by offering BIPOC. They can achieve or overcome this by offering BIPOC producers technical assistance, grants with adequate time to actually respond and draft intelligent and proper proposals. A low interest credit, access to equipment, financial support for monitoring and measuring, and free legal and accounting services. As a starting point, the state should provide support and funding for completing baseline soil health assessments, access to equipment, non-GMO seed, and access to affordable land. These services should be provided by experts who are linguistically and culturally competent. Policies should not benefit large, high-polluting operations or increase the inequities between large and small farmers, and thus who actually benefit from funding and resource allotment should be carefully scrutinized. New York State should ensure the participation of BIPOC farmers throughout the process, including design and implementation. In conclusion, New York State can build back better by making a commitment to a transformed farming and local food system instead of return to the status quo. Agricultural policy and practices have been misguided by processors, retailers, and chemical companies rather than our farmers. We need to move away from the mindset of bigger is better and more industrial inputs, and we cannot continue to maintain a cheap food by underpricing farm products and underpaying farm workers. Adding good practices to a bad system does not result in a long-term solution. People, land, and environment of New York State should benefit from the CLCPA scoping plan. The main thrust should be to transform New York State agriculture to support a network of diverse family-scale farms, rural and urban, using organic and agroecological practices, feeding local communities. That is all I have. I'm going to pass it over to Abigail to round us out for the final few slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. So I am Abby McHugh Griffa. I'm the Executive Director of the Climate Solutions Accelerator of the Genesee Finger Lakes region. And I'm just going to dig in a little bit deeper on some of what Jared was saying. So next slide, please. All right, so as Jared mentioned, the goal set by this panel of 30% emissions reduction in net greenhouse gases by 2050, which would return us to 1990 levels, is not ambitious enough, particularly given that forestry has the potential to achieve carbon neutrality or even become a carbon sink. A more aggressive goal for this sector is therefore recommended. New York should adopt the goals set forth in the Agricultural Resilience Act, a federal bill with comprehensive policies to reduce greenhouse gases from U.S. agricultural sector. The ARA proposes a goal of reducing greenhouse gases 50% from 2010 levels by 2030 and achieving net zero emissions by 2040. The panel should ensure that state funds are distributed equitably and do not disproportionately benefit the largest agricultural producers. Given the state's finite resources to fund incentive programs to increase voluntary adoption of greenhouse gas reducing practices, these resources should be preserved for small and mid-sized farms and socially disadvantaged producers. For New York State's largest farms who can better afford the transition, the panel's recommendations do not adequately consider the potential of regulatory measures to spur adoption of more sustainable practices. Indeed, New York's largest farms contribute the vast majority of agricultural pollution in the state. In 2017, out of over 4,600 dairy farms in New York, only 142 farms, or 3% of the total dairy farms, had herd sizes over 1,000 milk cows. And an additional 141 farms had herd sizes between 500 and 999 milk cows. That 6% of New York's dairies with over 500 milk cows account for about 56% of New York dairy cows' population and are responsible for the majority of methane emissions in the state. In the most recent round of Climate Resilient Farming Awards announced for 2021, a few large dairies received significant grants, up to $448,000, to install cover and flare systems. Over 30% of total program funds went to just 4 large dairies to adopt this practice. So again, the panel should ensure that state funds are distributed equitably and do not disproportionately benefit the largest agricultural producers. The panel should also consider additional strategies to address the climate and environmental harms of excessive fertilizer use. The manufacturing of nitrogen fertilizer supports the natural gas industry and disproportionately impacts low-income communities and communities of color. All nitrogen fertilizer begins with the production of ammonia from natural gas, and thus the link between nitrogen fertilizer use and fracking in the natural gas economy cannot be ignored. A U.S. Energy Information Administration article from 2017 states, the industrial sector as a whole, which includes methanol and ammonia or urea-based fertilizer plants, consumed an average of 21.2 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas in 2016, the highest amount since 2000. Natural gas consumption in this sector is forecast to rise in the EIA's short-term energy outlook as new plants come online. In 2015, the United States produced 9.4 million metric tons of ammonia, primarily for use as fertilizer. In 2015, the United States, which is projected to grow by 47% through the end of the decade. The manufacture of nitrogen fertilizer emits numerous health-harming pollutants, and these plants are often located in environmental justice communities. Nitrogen fertilizer not only impacts our climate with the release of nitrous oxide, but runoff also gets into water sources and private wells. The U.S. Geological Survey's National Water Quality Assessment Project took samples of principal groundwater aquifers used as United States public and private drinking water supplies. They found nitrate levels in groundwater under agricultural land roughly 3 times the national background level of 1 milligram per liter. From the information in this study, it can be estimated that 2% of public supply wells and 6% of private wells exceed the limits, and in agricultural areas, 21% of private wells exceeded those limits. Fertilizer pollution also causes deadly algae blooms, as Jared mentioned, that deplete oxygen from water bodies and lead to aquatic dead zones, including those in the Finger Lakes. Increasing funding and support for farms to transition to organic can provide climate benefits and reduce the impacts of nitrogen fertilizer use. New York State can fund this transition with a fee on fertilizer. Organic farms do not use synthetic nitrogen fertilizers or pesticides. Farms that seek organic certification must create an organic farm plan that includes carbon soil building practices. Setting state goals to increase conversion to organic systems will result in significant climate change mitigation, including a host of ecosystem services. By not using synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, organic farms reduce climate impacts by 30%, and this reduction in chemical fertilizer use would also have significant effect on the widespread problem of drinking water nitrates impacting rural communities in New York. New York should increase its fertilizer fee and use the proceeds to support these efforts. New York currently charges a fee of 10 cents per ton on fertilizer distributed in the state. This is one of the lowest fees in the nation. By increasing this fee and putting the money into a fund for farms willing to use more ecological practices, we can encourage both better nutrient management and other agroecological practices to protect families and communities from contamination. And one last point regarding this slide. The panel should include safeguards to ensure equitable workforce training and compensation. We support the panel's recommendations to utilize farmer-to-farmer education and provide technical assistance to increase adoption of agroecological practices. We'd also like to highlight some additional considerations for such programs. First, programs should provide direct compensation to farmers, as this learning and teaching is time-intensive. Second, any technical services and outreach should be provided by diverse service providers who have linguistic and cultural competency. Services and information should be provided in multiple languages and in a range of formats, including in-person, online, and written. New York State can reach diverse communities by partnering with community-based organizations and local community leaders who have already earned the trust of local farmers and ranchers. The state should pay BIPOC farmers, including migrant and refugee farmers and farm workers, to lead trainings and provide technical assistance in their own communities. New York State should also help BIPOC farmers connect and learn from each other and fund trainings on issues unique and salient to BIPOC communities. These trainings might cover topics such as how to navigate a racist food system, how to address BIPOC trauma, and BIPOC history. Next slide, please. Here we'd like to take a minute to distinguish between real and false solutions in the agricultural sector, starting with biomass. Like biofuels, burning trees is not a climate smart solution. Rather, wood burning emits more carbon pollution per unit of energy generated than burning fossil fuels, while removing a critical carbon sink. It is therefore not a carbon neutral strategy. Furthermore, biomass emits health-harming pollution, first at the site of intermediate processing into chips or pellets, and then again at the smokestack. Wood pellet production facilities emit high levels of particulate matter and VOC pollutants, and such facilities are often sited in disadvantaged communities, among other major sources of particulate matter and pollution, making biomass a contributor to environmental injustice. Similarly, state funds should not support the installation of biogas digesters at large concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. In New York State in 2016, manure management released 0.94 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent as methane, while enteric fermentation released 3.6 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent as methane. The CLCPA recommendations on agriculture should ensure that funds are directed toward reducing both sources of agricultural methane emissions, and that these funds build climate resiliency rather than entrenching poor practices at CAFOs. Biogas production is an inefficient strategy for mitigating animal agriculture's methane emissions when compared to alternatives that can reduce waste at its source. Biogas incentivizes the expansion of CAFOs, which are inherently unsustainable. It mostly benefits the largest, least sustainable CAFOs, making it more difficult for smaller, more sustainably managed farms to compete. By requiring methane production to be profitable, these systems promote waste generation. Furthermore, methane leakage from anaerobic digesters can be substantial, causing some to be net sources of methane rather than offsetting methane emissions. Biodigesters also release additional air pollutants such as nitrogen oxide, sulfur oxide, and particulate matter, which can endanger surrounding communities. They do little to alleviate the CAFO's adverse impacts on surrounding communities and allow noxious odors, surface and groundwater contamination from digester effluent, and other environmental harms to persist. In addition to being sources of climate emissions, the large amounts of manure produced at CAFOs also contributes to air and water pollution. This manure can contain plant nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus, pathogens such as E. coli, growth hormones, antibiotics, and other chemicals used in agricultural production. When manure is not managed correctly, as is often the case, it can run into local groundwater and drinking water supplies, resulting in poor water quality and harm to local communities. CAFOs also release other air pollutants such as ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and particulate matter, which can harm community air quality and contribute to development of respiratory illnesses such as asthma. Communities also complain about the odors produced by CAFOs, which can significantly lower the quality of life for people living near the CAFOs. We recommend that the CAC propose allocating funds toward more transformative practices upstream of manure management, manure storage, and toward practices that smaller producers can adopt. Manure management practices at large operations are already eligible for support through the Agricultural Non-Point Source Pollution Abatement and Control Program, which in 2018 allocated $8.9 million to projects including manure storage and management practices. While cover and flare systems do provide large reductions in methane emissions, there are more ambitious options that should be implemented to address enteric fermentation and reduce emissions generation in the first place. These include using feed additives and implementing dietary changes to reduce enteric fermentation, using dry manure management to reduce methane generation, and transitioning to managed pasture-based and low-density farming to reduce the concentration and quantity of stored manure, and thus the generation of methane while improving soil health. And lastly, for this slide, the scoping plan should include a pathway for the electrification of farm vehicles and equipment. The law requires it, and zero emissions equipment would improve the health of farmers and farm workers. Next and last slide, please. The state must implement policies to overcome systemic racism in New York State farming. Black and Indigenous farmers and ranchers of color have historically and to this day faced racial discrimination that has led to vast inequities in farm ownership and control. The farm worker population that labors on agricultural lands today is largely Hispanic, while only a tiny fraction of farm owners are Hispanic. At the same time, farmers of color and Indigenous farmers have developed and used sustainable agricultural practices for centuries. We urge measures that allow Black, Indigenous, and other farmers of color to be provided with funding and technical assistance that support productive, sustainable agricultural efforts. The state should prioritize and set aside specific funding and benefits for BIPOC farmers in all voluntary incentive programs that pay farmers to adopt conservation practices. Targets should be set for specific subpopulations within the broader category of socially disadvantaged farmers to ensure equitable distribution, and data should be made publicly available for transparency and accountability. Funding for socially disadvantaged farmers should be primarily in the form of grants rather than loans. Application processes should be streamlined and technical assistance should be provided to ensure there are no additional barriers to socially disadvantaged farmers accessing these resources. The timing of applications should also be cognizant and aligned with the growing seasons. New York State should provide land to BIPOC farmers, including current farm workers and other minority groups that have been historically excluded from farming in New York State. Land access is a significant barrier to many farms, especially BIPOC farmers. Small farms often lease land and are confronted with moving entire farming operations periodically. This impacts long-term stewardship of the land and specifically disrupts a process of transitioning to organic production or climate-friendly practices, which can take several years of cultivation to fully reap benefits. Climate injustice will therefore be simultaneously served if BIPOC farmers are given permanent farmlands. Lastly, New York State should support community gardens and protect them from development, given the numerous benefits they offer community members. Urban agriculture and community gardens offer residents health, social, cultural, and environmental benefits, including building community resilience to climate change, particularly for communities in areas that lack access to green space and nutritious food options, which are disproportionately Black and Latinx. Community gardens and urban farms provide access to the outdoors and an opportunity for the community to grow its own fresh, healthy, and culturally appropriate foods. And that is the end of our presentation. So whatever questions you have, please let us know.
This is Richard Ball at Ag and Markets. Thank you, Sonal, Jared, and Abigail for the very detailed thoughts that you've given to us. Certainly, we'll look forward to expanding on some of this dialogue back and forth, I think. I think that I want to start at your last comment on diversity and racial equity. I couldn't agree more. We've actually recently released a report that we started back in 2019, actually started in 2017 when we saw the NASS data show us what the trends were on different populations. And we saw women in agriculture numbers increasing slightly as they began to more accurately count women in agriculture. But we saw the disappointing returns on BIPOC farmers. And at that time, we began thinking about that pretty seriously. And we put together a diversity and racial equity working group. I see you've got a couple of slides from that at the very end, so I assume you've seen the report. If anyone would like to see the report, we can certainly provide the link to that. But it was a couple-year process of listening to BIPOC farmers from across the state. It was a very enlightening opportunity to listen. And to hear, the challenges around access to land, access to capital, access to training, and the challenges with navigating the current systems for all those. It's very rewarding, and I think you'll see there's 21 recommendations in the report. Happy to get into that and again share that report. We've got a number of positive things, and you noted some of them about our farm activities. I've been farming since I was 18 years old. And I remember that there was, back in those days, conventional agriculture on one side of the room, and there was organic agriculture on the other side of the room. And I have to say that we've come a long way since that time. When I visit the NOFA conference, or I visit the vegetable grower conference or the fruit conferences, the most packed attendance seminars are those surrounding soil health. And the commonality there that both sides of agriculture have understood and are coming to understand in a bigger way gives me an awful lot of encouragement. We've got some pretty good things underway here. Actually, the work of the Watershed Ag Council that was brought up earlier kind of spurred us to develop in New York State our AIM program, Agriculture Environmental Management. And that's the basis for how we look at farms. It's the basis for how we market New York grown and certified products in the state. I'd be happy to show you that the small farm participation in that program outweighs all the larger farms in the state by a wide margin. So I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. And I think the scoping plan and the work that our ag and forestry work panel worked on can get us where we need to go. So appreciate all of this. Been taking lots of notes, and we'll look forward to continuing the discussion. But thank you all.
Looks like Anne has a question.
Yes, I suspect this is a question I should know the answer to, but the 30% figure that was referenced, that wasn't the goal so much as all the recommendations that the advisory panel came up with added together. That's as far as it got. Do I have that right? It's not like that's what they were aiming for. It was more, or that's what the recommendations added up to.
I'm sorry, Ann, who was that directed towards?
Anyone who knows. It's not, I guess it's not really a question for Abby, but I guess it would, maybe we don't have to answer it now if the person's not here, but the someone who knows the numbers from the advisory panel's recommendations for forestry and agriculture.
I think that the 40% reduction was really statewide emissions requirements. That's all of the work panels, basically all the sectors. So clearly, you know, we've got larger challenges in transportation, housing, and waste. You know, the agricultural one, that's why it was 30%, because we have a smaller impact on the overall. So that's a reason for that discrepancy right there.
All right, let me ask this. Thank you. I think you just answered it, but just let me make sure I got it right. Was the advisory panel aiming for 30% reductions, or did they make a lot of recommendations, and when they analyzed how far that would get, it got to 30% reductions?
No, we began with the 30%. Clearly, after looking at the test case that we saw in our last meeting, the goalposts have been moved a little bit. So we need to look at how we can either make more dramatic attempts or, frankly, speed up investments and speed up the pace that we take up to get to those reduction targets. But that was initially the goal, was 30%.
Got it. Thank you. And as I said, I should have known that before.
Well, it shows you've been doing your homework.
I see Dennis has his hand up. Dennis, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, thanks. Thanks for the amount of information. There's a lot of detail, and I think that's what we need. We're getting to the point where we got to get much more granular in observations as well as suggestions, because we need to move from the 50,000. Wish I could have done that down to here's what we think we should be doing with block and tackling. So what maybe to Jared and or Sanal, and I apologize, Sanal, if I mispronounced your name. But recently, the Public Service Commission put out another order relative to directing utilities to submit transmission and distribution proposals. And it's because we've created these generation pockets, so renewable energy, and that is more focused on land availability than co-location where we have load centers. So it's really a reaction to a policy that's been in place today. When you looked at this, the scoping document and then the directives of the CLCPA from the perspective of smart growth, how much consideration or how much thought process have you put into the type of electrical infrastructure? And is there enough focus on electric infrastructure to meet kind of like your thought process of mixed use, decarbonization, adding electrification, electric vehicles, et cetera, and then also, is there enough on the economic development side that truly would create location-based jobs for disadvantaged communities? So I'm trying to understand, how you look at, these individual items coming out of, whether they come out of NYSERDA, the Public Service Commission, DOT, or any of the other state agencies. And do you see them coming together that you're comfortable that I think Sonal said to avoid the land of unintentional consequences?
Is that question directed specifically to one or the other of us?
I had mentioned either Jared or Sonal. And I apologize if I misspoke Sonal's name.
Thanks, Dennis. It's pronounced Sonal.
Thank you.
Just for future reference. And yeah, I'm jotting down your question because I think these are things that we want to be going back with our working group and agreeing on an answer before bringing back to you, because it's not a consensus if we just answer them ourselves right now. I think just overarchingly, the goal is to be expanding drastically and dramatically the use of renewable energy, to be supplying that for all different considerations for smart growth, whether that be the rural, suburban, or municipal smart growth, and for that to be covering pretty much all type of all sides of the economy is what I'm trying to get at. And that it be done through electrification. So I think the consideration is that electrification needs to be deployed on a really, really high scale. And that, I mean, in terms of your question around the economic development, I don't know the perfect answer to that question. I think that's something that we as a working group needs to talk about amongst ourselves. I think it's just all a matter of really investing dramatically in the solutions that at least the working group and other environmental justice groups want to see done to achieve that kind of smart growth in consideration of all these unintended consequences. I mean, I think for the unintended consequences, it's important to continually track what's going on and track how disadvantaged communities are being invested in, and track what type of land use is being created or invested in those disadvantaged communities. I think to some extent, it's hard to pre-plan for all unintended consequences, but there are a lot that we know of, such as co-pollutants, that we can be tracking and preparing for, ahead of time. But I think in general, we'll need to go back and discuss your question and come up with a group answer.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think we got to think about this, and is it intuitive to you that electrifying will create opportunity or any level of impact on local electric distribution systems that we should be considering as we're looking at all of these recommendations? Or should we wait to create the problem and then solve the distribution system?
I think the former rather than the latter, I would say.
Thank you.
This is Rawa. If I could just also add one other thing, I certainly agree with Sonal that we will be taking these questions back to the full group, and I think submitting more thorough answers in writing to the Climate Action Council. But I think that what we're asking for, and certainly what the Climate Justice Working Group has been working on in our recommendations and how we think about disadvantaged communities, and disadvantaged communities, both urban, suburban, and rural, is having as much nuance as possible, and that there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all solution in all of the regions in New York State. And so one of the recommendations I know we're going to be asking for is having kind of some regional sort of economic development council approaches to how we are looking at the investments in DACs in the different regions across the state, and having a body that is more looking at what the interventions at the local level and place-based levels to see if they are working, right? Because what some of the recommendations that, for example, came out in the land use one will greatly benefit suburban areas, but may not in high density urban areas, and it may not in rural communities. So I think that's what we're asking for overall, is to make smart growth as intelligent as possible. We have to add layers of nuance, and really that level of expertise is going to be dependent on the people that are living in those communities.
Can I just chime in to amplify? Rawa, I think you're absolutely right, and that you sound like you're actually sitting in some of the advisory panel meetings. Just wanted to, I 100% agree that smart growth is more than just focusing. It doesn't just focus on new development, and I think that the advisory panel during the discussions was, during their deliberations, we were focusing on, thinking about how to avoid gentrification. How do we ensure that the community, that investment happens in the communities that most need it, and how do we ensure that that those investments are done in a way that benefits the community and that is desired by the community. I think those are two sort of critical pieces, which is why I think you'll see in the recommendations a lot of focus on the community itself and sort of going down, decentralizing. I think your point about regional sort of metrics may be a good one, because we really focus on how do we engage the community, how do we constantly engage the community, and the back and forth with the communities at various levels to ensure that this isn't just, there isn't a one size fits all. So I think you're absolutely right, and that is the direction that land use does need to go, and smart growth certainly focuses on both existing development, infill, and new development. But thank you very much, and I do want to take this opportunity to thank the Climate Justice Working Group and those of you that presented today. This really is really helpful and interesting feedback.
Bob Howard, I see you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. I want to thank the panelists and the working group generally, and I agree with much of what you've said in the detail. You've clearly put a lot of thought into it. I do disagree with some of your detail, though, and now's not necessarily the time to go through it all, but I'd like to raise an issue or two and suggest that we need to have a way for the working group to get together with the Ag and Forestry group, as well as some of us on the Climate Action Council, and hash some of this out. So for context, I'm a research scientist. I've worked for decades on nitrogen sources from agriculture and water pollution. We're working on the Finger Lakes harmful algal blooms. We work on groundwater contamination of nitrogen. So I think the data would suggest that yes, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is a problem for groundwater, but in New York, manure is the far bigger problem, and our overuse of manure and our rather poor handling of manure. So we should tackle both of those. No-till agriculture was put forward as something that your group favors because of carbon sequestration. I would point out that aggravates nitrogen pollution downstream. No-till fields in New York State, northeastern areas lose nitrogen more than if you have conventional tillage. So we have some cross messaging and cross purposes there we need to work out. And I agree totally that we could probably use less synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, and it is coming from fracked gas, and that's problematic. We should look at that. I also think we need to have a better way of handling manure statewide. And I think, though I understand some of your concerns about using anaerobic digesters at farm scale to handle it, I think it might be certainly one of the best two options out there for handling manure better. And so we need to be open to consideration of that. But I have a specific question for Abby. I wasn't aware that we had a fee on fertilizer. So that was a very interesting thing to point out. And to hear there was low is interesting. I wonder if you have a specific recommendation on what a fee for synthetic nitrogen fertilizer should be. Thank you.
That is a great question, Bob. I really appreciate it. And we will have to get back to you on that. I'm definitely not the person to throw that number out.
Okay, thank you.
Donna DeCarolis, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick question, and thank you again for the presentation. I echo my fellow CAC members in saying what a thorough job you've all done. I just wondered, could you tell me, did your group at all discuss the potential for soil CO2 sequestration? And if so, I was just curious, what you all thought. It seems like a positive for the farming community and could create another option for compliance for New York State. And just also potentially have an economic development, benefit as well. So just curious if you all discussed that. Thank you.
Donna, can you repeat just the question one more time? I want to make sure I completely understand it before taking a crack at that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Did you discuss the potential for soil CO2 sequestration?
Okay.
That was the gist of it.
So I think, overarching in the recommendations, we didn't drill into that too specifically, but promoting soil health, which would lead to sequestration, we obviously recognize as a need. And again, we can, kind of go back and come up with a groupthink answer on this. But, from the environmental justice perspective and that lens that we're trying to bring to this, a lot of the message that we're trying to convey today is, how do you make it financially feasible, and technically feasible for the smaller farmers, for BIPOC farmers to remain competitive while also pursuing these, soil health practices that sequester carbon? So yes, absolutely recognizing the need for sequestering carbon in the soils overall. And from our working group's perspective, thinking really about how do you make that something that everyone can do and still be competitive in the market. And we can, if you need us to, we can certainly get back to you with more detail.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any other hand raised from council members. So we'll just give it another minute here.
Sorry, Sarah, I realized I was late to the queue. I did
Peter.
raise my hand. This is Peter.
Sorry. Thank you, Peter. Go ahead.
Yeah, obviously, thanks so very much to all the members of the Climate Justice Working Group and those who are part of it who are here with us today. And just to uplift comments that Basil Segos started at the beginning of the meeting, we pass along our love and condolences to Elizabeth Yampier and the family on the death of Elizabeth's mom. She's been a good colleague and partner in our process, and we send a lot of love and condolences her way. So I just wanted to, folks who may have not been here at the beginning of the meeting to know that. The other question I have, Abigail, is, really interesting to sort of hear your commentary about anaerobic digesters, particularly with CAFOs. I mean, did the Climate Justice Working Group kick around the idea of maybe just banning them outright? It seems like there's a lot of societal issues you work through, a lot of pressures, and maybe methane capture is just making a situation that is bad less bad. But I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I asked that question. The other comment I want to make just before I listen to your answer in that question is really happy to see you all address the issue of farm tractor and equipment emissions. I think it is a category that is covered by law and should be something that we advance recommendations to, zero out emissions from that sector as we're doing with transportation and buildings. So thank you for highlighting and uplifting that and the role that it plays in terms of protecting those who are acutely exposed to those emissions, being farmers themselves and farm workers. But anyways, back to my question about CAFOs. Should we ban them?
Are you saying ban the CAFOs or ban the anaerobic digesters on the CAFOs? Which just
Well, I mean, it sounded like that the Climate Justice Working Group was not supportive of anaerobic digesters on the CAFOs for starters. But then, did you kick around the idea of whether New York State should actually set limits in the amount of animals at these operations and maybe ban a certain concentration of animals at farm operations?
So we do not have a consensus opinion on that, so we'll have to get back to you on the specifics. Again, I think it all comes back to, for us, thinking big picture about what is the impact of these operations, not only on greenhouse gas emissions, although of course that's a huge consideration. And Bob, I appreciate you bringing up. I'm not the one to run the numbers. I don't know that any of us on the Climate Justice Working Group would feel that we had the expertise to really dig into the numbers and understand specifically with anaerobic digesters, whether it's a yay or a nay or somewhere in between. But for everything I think that we've brought to you, not just today, but in past meetings, the message is, or one of the key messages, that we can't only be thinking about carbon emissions, but we have to be thinking more broadly about what is the impact on the community, what is the impact on workers, what are some of the historical injustices that different practices either exacerbate or can address. So again, we can, as a group, come back together and discuss the specific question about whether a ban on anaerobic digesters, CAFOs, would be appropriate. But just, to emphasize that broader framing and thinking, and I think, Dennis, this might have been something you brought up in a past meeting about, what kind of science and expertise we're looking at to inform choices that go into the scoping plan, that the hard sciences obviously are so important, but we also need to be thinking about, the social sciences as well, and that just impact on people's lives and ability to think about, co-benefits as we take action. So I don't know if that really addresses your question, Peter, and if anyone else on the working group wants to take a crack, certainly invite them to, but we can get back to you as well.
I'll pause now to see if anybody from the working group wanted to chime in, particularly for your last broader point, which I wholeheartedly agree with. Looking at the statute, it's about pollution reductions, but it's also centering equity and justice as we achieve those pollution reductions, which makes, I think, our law a lot different than some of its predecessor versions across the country.
Yeah, this is Rawa again. Thank you so much for that question, Peter. I wholeheartedly agree with what Abigail just said, which is we're really going to take this back to the group and really crunch those numbers and get back to you. And I think it's important for us too, is that, what we're trying to show is how we have been practicing. What the Climate Justice Working Group has been doing is that we believe in consensus and having these conversations with each other, both to develop our own learning and understanding, but to make sure that we are coming to you with a really holistic framework, and that we have, addressed multiple issues around equity, but also really looking at the science and the problem that's in front of us. And I think that's ultimately what we are asking the Climate Action Council to do as well. And it sounds like you guys already are. We just want to put an exclamation point on it, which is that, obviously we do have to look at the science, where we are, what opportunities are in front of us, how do we continue to iterate and evolve even as the technology continues to change over the next decade or so. But at the same time too, and that's what, as we've been going through the disadvantaged communities, is really having a holistic lens on it. We have to mitigate the harms that have happened, in particular to communities of color and poor and working class communities across the state and certainly the nation, but New York State, to address some of the interventions and the investments that we are making are going to lift, all boats, or give some people a boat that didn't have one, right? And so I think that is the lens with which we've been looking at everything. So when we are coming to y'all, it's not that we have all the answers or solutions. It's really just to say, have you thought of like this framing and this orientation for the solution? And oftentimes one of the first questions we ask ourselves are, what are the potential harms that we may cause by having this solution? And we hope that the Climate Action Council really adopts that practice.
Thanks, Robert. That was additional input and granularity that made a lot of sense, and I really appreciate it. And thanks for taking the time to lay it out there on the table for us today.
I think we want to wrap up the conversation in the next 5 or 10 minutes here so we can move on to the integration analysis. But I do see we have 2 council members' hands up. So if we can go to Raya Salter, followed by Ann Reynolds.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you so much to the Climate Justice Working Group for putting together yet another very thoughtful, thorough, and forceful set of recommendations. And my question is to Sarah and also, our august co-chairs, Basil, Green. What is, echoing what Sonal said in her presentation, what is going to be the mechanism, process for substantive integration of the Climate Justice Working Group recommendations, as well as direct feedback back to the group in terms of the intentions of this body?
Sarah, do you want to discuss the integrate? Yeah, I mean, you've certainly looked at this from both vantage points. I want to see what you've gleaned from your participation in the groups as well.
Sure. So in terms of how this is working its way into ultimately, I would say the scoping plan and what would be released as the draft scoping plan, what we're doing as a staff team is working on turning the advisory panel recommendations as they had been provided into, or pulling them into a document and explaining how they are working towards achieving our goals. In the process of doing that, there's obviously the integration analysis that will be informing that. And we have the feedback from the Climate Justice Working Group members that we're also working in as we take a look at those recommendations. We're trying to note where Climate Justice Working Group feedback has been provided, and in areas certainly if it contradicts with what the advisory panels have put forth. So the idea will be that when the council receives the initial draft of the scoping plan, they'll have all of the information that has been provided both from the advisory panels as well as the feedback from the Climate Justice Working Group incorporated and kind of noted in that document. Beyond, excuse me, beyond that, once we provide the actual draft of the scoping plan to the council members for their review, we anticipate having small group sessions with the council members by topic area. We're still kind of working out some of the details of that, but we're thinking that it would make sense to have conversations aligned around either the chapters or the topic areas. So for instance, we might have a conversation, a small group session that we organize around transportation and would allow an opportunity for the council members to discuss what's been provided in the draft scoping document to date and whether they're comfortable with what's in there or they think it should be modified to reflect a different position or opinion of the council. Doreen or Basil, maybe I can hand it back to you in terms of addressing the specific council feedback to some of the recommendations that, or some of the feedback that has been provided by the Climate Justice Working Group in terms of formal response from the council?
Well, I certainly think a great example of this in action would be what you're about to see from Carl Maass in the integration of the feedback we've received into the integration analysis itself. You know, to some extent, this becomes an analytic exercise, and to the other extent, it becomes a policy making and I would call it a more qualitative exercise as well. But at the end, it's going to fit in one or the other category, and ultimately, this is a good example of it manifest in the work that we've been doing over the past month to produce the feedback you'll see today. So that's just I like to try to make things tangible. So that's a good example if that's useful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sarah, are we ready to move on, or did we have another question?
Ann Reynolds did have her hand raised. I see it's down now, but Ann, did you want to quickly ask your question?
My question was back on anaerobic digestion, and we've kind of moved past that. So I think you can move on to, I'm anxious to see the integration analysis update. So.
All right, thank you. And so with that, I will turn it back to you, Doreen.
Great, thanks. Thanks everyone for that robust discussion. And I know that we are we're looking forward to more feedback in subsequent meetings to this effect. But as we pivot now again back to the analytics side of our work, at the last meeting, Carl Maass, my colleague from NYSERDA, presented some initial outputs from the integration analysis and showed us a comparison of the pathways work done under our prior accounting methodology as compared to the accounting required by the CLCPA. Last time, he also shared what we are referring to as a test run of the analytical engine, which is a first look at what the advisory panel recommendations could provide in terms of potential emission reductions in relation to the emission limits prescribed by the Climate Act. So today we will continue with a discussion on the scenario planning informed by feedback received from the council members after the meeting in July. So although the integration analysis is designed to provide support for the scoping plan, it is not synonymous with the plan as a whole, which is what I was getting at before. It is designed to assess the greenhouse gas reductions, benefits, and costs of portfolios of measures statewide, so the implications of various policy recommendations can be understood. So the integration analysis will certainly be an important tool for the members to assess as we develop the scoping plan as laid out by Sarah. So with that, and hopefully with no need for technical challenges, I'll hand it to Carl Maass to continue with his work in the integration analysis.
Great, thank you, Doreen, and thank you, Council, for inviting me to come back. It's a pleasure to speak with you again. I'll probably rehash a little bit of Doreen's introduction, but before I do that, I did want to go to the next slide and just recap on one of the key takeaway slides that we had last time. So there's no new information here. This is just a bit of a reformatting. A number of the council members wanted to see this slide again. And so this was one of our summary slides from last time. And just to recap what it shows is this is our carbon footprint as a state, starting at around 400 million metric tons and forecasted into the future. The black line is what we've called the reference case, which is our set of initial accounting for under our new CLCPA framework, but looking at business as usual for economic development, population growth, and then layering on top of that our existing policies. And as you see, it does bend the curve down, but does leave a substantial gap between existing policies and where we need to go. And that is the challenge that was laid before us with the CLCPA. And so we then did our test run, which we're calling here our initial modeled actions, which took our advisory panel's recommendations. And you'll see those two orange diamonds for 2030, approximately 30% reduction economy-wide, in 2050, approximately 80%. So a substantial step forward through those recommendations and a steep decline, but still leaving more room for action. And so that's the work that we've been thinking through with you over these past weeks as to what additional levers can we pull to help us get to those limits of 40% and 85%. Next slide, please. So at our last meeting, I was able to hear from all of you, and my team was able to hear a number of your thoughts around ways that we can go deeper and go faster. And just as a reminder, as Doreen said, this analysis that we're going to be presenting over the next 6 weeks or so, where today is a bit more of a process stop along the way to make sure that we are measuring properly and framing our scenarios properly. It's really to look at the physical infrastructure changes that would need to occur in order to hit those goals, in order to achieve those limits. And really it answers what I've called the kind of what we need to do. This will serve as one piece of the scoping plan, as Doreen mentioned, which is really the how are we going to get there. We've heard from a number of council members, both during the previous meeting, and we've heard from you in written and verbal form over the intervening weeks. My goal today is really threefold. One is to reflect back what we've heard, and I'll try to make some ties to the working groups and what we've heard from them. We've really benefited greatly from being able to join the council, me and my team, to listen directly to what the Climate Justice Working Group has to say. And we hope that it's reflected in the proposals that we have at the end of the slides. And what we want to do is create a space for the council to dialogue around these proposals, to debate different priorities, and to review this proposal that we have, which will be how we propose to look at our scenarios, to look at different lenses through which we can analyze what we need to do to hit our limits. So with that, next slide, please. We've binned the feedback that we've heard into a few different categories. And in these first categories is around buildings and natural gas system. And you'll see that there are a diverse set of views from council members. And again, at the end of the slides, I'll be able to reflect back, I think, those different diverse views in our scenario framing. But just to pick through some of what we've heard. From some members, we've heard a call to examine how to use the existing natural gas equipment and system as a method for decarbonization, looking at hybrid energy heating systems for the use of RNG and hydrogen and for carbon capture and storage. We've also heard views and calls for us to examine a future where bioenergy is not pursued as a method of decarbonization and to exclude hydrogen blending as an option for space heating. We've also heard from the council that we should examine cross-cutting solutions and what is the timing for the decommissioning of our natural gas system. Whereas we've seen through most studies, we will need to shrink the footprint of the natural gas system, and a call for how can we explore, how to most appropriately and cost effectively do that, and what would be the timing for that. And then we specifically, partly I think in response to what I presented last time, a call for us to examine early replacement, perhaps with a focus on accelerated retirement for large customers, and perhaps look at keeping end-of-life replacement for smaller customers, and maybe do a sensitivity around that. So those were some of the views in response to some of the bending further of the curve that we need to do for buildings. Also partly related as it relates to natural gas system for other methane emissions. We've heard a call to look at various levels of addressing methane leakage from our waste and our other related systems, landfills, sewage systems, as well as abandoned gas and oil wells. And so I think there was not only a call for how do we go deeper, how do we reduce methane leakage further, but let's do sensitivities around that and look at different levels within our scenario framework. And what I think I'll do is, just for the sake of time, I'll go through the first few slides and then I'll pause and we can have some dialogue. Happy to go back to, go back to specific bullets, but let's try to step through them. So next slide. And then focusing on transportation and power generation, we heard within transportation, I think it reflected some of what we heard from the Climate Justice Working Group, that we should examine various levels, both go deeper in our vehicle miles of travel reduction, but look at various levels. where we may see different risk of adoption of some of these options. But certainly a clear call for expanding public transit, which is both about reducing greenhouse gases and providing other options for mobility across our urban, suburban, and rural areas. For power generation, we did hear a call for some specific examination of looking at higher levels, 8 gigawatts of more storage, going beyond our 9 gigawatts of offshore wind. I will say that our modeling framework does allow for that. As you presented last summer, we already have seen that the model is endogenously bringing forward higher levels of both storage and renewables, including offshore wind, in order to meet our large growth in electrification in 2040 and 2050. We are going to see the need to go beyond those specific goals that are set in the law today. So we really are viewing those provisions in the law of 9 gigawatts of offshore wind, 6 gigawatts of solar as minimums. And then we will allow our tools to allow us to explore through the scenarios how we have to go above those in order to hit our limits. There's also a call for consideration of advantages and disadvantages and looking at the interchange of energy to our neighbors, in this case RTOs, which are the regional transmission owners, so our neighbors to the east, west, south, and north. And I can confirm that our model is able to explicitly model all of the neighboring electric regions, all of our neighboring RTOs, and does look at the dynamic flow of electricity between New York State and its neighbors. And then there was a call for us to consider looking at scenarios where the zero emission electricity was met 5 years earlier. So that's certainly something that we could explore. One challenge there, of course, is we already are at a 90+ zero emission grid by 2035 because of all the activities that we'll have to bring forward. So there may be only marginal benefit to going earlier to a zero emission grid and potentially with higher risks of technology and also cost. And so next slide, and then I can pause and actually 2 more slides and then I'll be able to pause. So for system dynamics, we've heard a call, sorry, back one more, perfect, slide 28. Increased focus on demand solutions to meet load rather than increased supply. So I think we've heard a call, again, both from our council members that historically we've looked predominantly at a fixed demand, a fixed load, and we've tried to bend our supply system around it. And what we're hearing call for is we need to have an active and dynamic load, both to reduce costs, but also to look at opportunities where those activities for distributed energy resources could benefit local communities. And we will be looking not at New York State as one single bubble, but actually breaking it up into different regions. And we'll be looking at aggressive opportunities for load flexibility. Similar to that, we want to consider the benefits and opportunities for microgrids and distributed energy resources. So that links into that first bullet. We also have been asked to look holistically at energy storage, including distributed battery, as well as thermal storage in our buildings. And we are actively looking at those resources, including looking at electric vehicles. And both their ability to be virtual batteries because they can shift when they charge, which allows us to have a really important ability to fix a problem, which could be everyone trying to charge at peak, and instead look at being able to, what is the opportunity space for being able to shift the charging and be able to reduce our system costs. There's been some specific calls around how we electrify our buildings and look at different heat pump technologies. So we hear that, and we can look at different technology options. And then looking at a consideration for the source of electricity used to produce hydrogen, and specifically take into account upstream emissions, which may lead us into leaning into the renewable energy sources of hydrogen where we don't have those upstream emissions. And then finally, the last slide, just a bullet, next slide, yep, on federal policies. And so a reminder from the council for us to examine what other jurisdictions are looking at. It's called out in the law itself, and I can confirm that we are. And the advisory panels did specifically look at other states and other regions, including Europe, to see what best practices are there, what technologies could be brought forward in the New York context. And then there was a specific call to include the proposed federal clean energy standard. It has a different name, but it has a similar intention to the New York State Clean Energy Standard. I will note that that standard, as proposed, is setting forward an 80% clean energy goal. As we've shown you in the modeling previously, we think we will exceed that. We will be approaching 90% by 2030. So we think we already are setting through the goals in the CLCPA and the existing policies that are in force that we are already going to exceed that federal mandate. So I'll pause there before going on to some other slides and see if there are other points of clarification that maybe some of the council members wanted to bring forward, or perhaps some dialogue around some of these key points.
Carl, I see Raya's hand raised as well as Paul Shepson. I'm not sure if you want me to handle hands or if you want to.
Yeah, please. Yeah, if you could, that'd be great, Sarah. So Raya, I think you mentioned first.
Yes, I'll go ahead. It's actually, my hand is up. I think I'd forgotten to put it down from before, but that's all right, because I certainly do have questions or a few thoughts. Maybe I'll put a few things here. I know that, in our small group session, I thought it was really important that Bob Howard's analysis, and particularly on blue hydrogen, be a part of the inputs to this study. And in particular, as we talk about what other states, regions, localities, and nations are doing, it should be only those type of projects and processes that are CLCPA compliant and can measure it with the best science that we know, which includes Bob's work. And I think I will leave it there for now, but that I think is one of my first questions here.
Sure, yeah, no, and I can reflect back that, as I've presented previously, every aspect of this analysis will incorporate the new thinking and findings that we pulled out of the CLCPA. So again, doing total fuel cycle analysis for all fossil fuels. So to the degree that hydrogen might be produced by fossil fuels, it would include all the upstream emissions. And therefore, the only way that we can see that there would be zero emissions directly from that production would be through a renewable resource through electrolysis.
Thank you, and I think as many others, it probably goes without saying that I personally do not think that the scenarios should include so-called RNG, should not include the sort of ongoing use of the existing gas infrastructure for a lot of reasons, health and otherwise. It's my opinion that these technologies go against the sort of letter and the intent of the CLCPA, both substantively but also procedurally. So of course, the procedure to the CLCPA is what makes it so unique among climate laws, in particular, the analysis of whether or not there will be harm to disadvantaged communities. So I guess my other question is, how can we make sure, even in these scenarios, which I believe should not be examined, and it's in fact, I think a waste of our time and resources to be examining them, but even in these scenarios that are being examined, how do we build in this do no harm to disadvantaged communities piece? Because I think it's very clear, as we've heard from the Climate Justice Working Group on several occasions, that say in particular RNG, the plans for what may be happening there could be dangerous to the health and welfare of disadvantaged communities in particular.
Right. So for all of our scenarios, and again, thank you, Raya, for the input, and don't want to cut off any council members, so I'll just be brief, who may want to respond. But we will be looking at the co-pollutants that will come from each of our scenarios. So where there is combustion in any scenario, we will be doing carbon accounting as well as co-pollutant accounting.
I hear that. I think there are also emerging issues of that there's sort of more and more understanding of in terms of what burning gas in homes, what the negative health impacts are there, and sort of the benefits of not having that happen. So I thank you very much for that. But I also think that co-pollutants may not be it's an indicator, but it certainly should not be the only indicator. in fact, where these, part of it is, it's like, what will the co-pollutants be going forward? But what would the alternative be? So if we focus on keeping those landfills unfilled and we don't use that approach, what would the health and the co-location benefits be? So co-pollutants is a good start, but I suggest is not sort of the beginning and the end.
Great. I think, Sarah, did you say Paul Shepson might have had his hand up, and was there anyone else in queue?
We've got Paul, then Dennis, and then Bob.
Okay.
Okay, Carl, thank you. You mentioned that you're going to discuss physical technical engineering approaches. I'm just wondering if you are doing scenario analysis on economic levers, incentives, considering carbon taxes, that sort of thing, or is that going to be discussed later? I think in particular, discussing a carbon tax is very important.
That's a great segue to the next slide. So I'll put that on pause for now, and then we will get right back to it.
Thank you.
Dennis, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah. Well, first, Carl, I just want to commend you and your team for, not just going ahead with your recommendations. You really went out of your way to get feedback and then back and forth conversation. So I just want to tell you how much, we on the council appreciate that. The slide previous, when we were talking about on the demand side, just wanted to make sure that, part of the assessment is to really think about it from an economic development. The regional economic development councils have projections on load pockets that are out there that they anticipate growth in very isolated areas. And I just want to make sure that, we're kind of like contemplating how do we include that kind of information when we're doing the demand side assessments. Because I want to avoid these generation pockets. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think I caught that. And I think also we have that both captured earlier, and I agree with you that we need to be thinking about how we're not developing our system in a way that has unintended consequences, including an ability to get the energy to where we need it to go, and that we think holistically as we're building out the grid, which often is not the case, right? It's a reactive system that's driven by an individual, one driver at a time, instead of it being multifactorial. Absolutely, I think that our scoping plan needs to address that.
Thanks, Carl.
Howard?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Carl, for the summary so far to date. I think you've done a really fine job of trying to capture the input you've been hearing from all of us. I also want to thank Raya for highlighting my paper with Mark Jacobson, but a follow-up question on that. I do believe we demonstrated pretty strongly that you do not want to be generating hydrogen. We in the state do not want to be generating hydrogen from any fossil fuel. And I think I heard you agree with that just now. If so, that's great. I appreciate it. But you still are proposing to look at hydrogen blending perhaps in the natural gas infrastructure stream. And if that is to come just from renewable electricity, I would agree with Raya that that's not a great use of your time and resources. The efficiency of generating hydrogen from 100% renewable electricity and then burning it again is really, really low. And you get about 10 times more useful energy by using that renewable electricity directly. And I think you can show that with a back the envelope calculation and not put a huge amount of time into it. But just that's my thought. If you proceed, I think that will be your conclusion, but I would urge you to put your resources elsewhere. I also just want to add a little bit on the renewable natural gas thing because it keeps coming up and again and again, and I have sort of mixed feelings on it. But I personally am of the view that we should be using the methane that's coming off of existing landfills. We should be doing everything we can to minimize future methane in landfills. We should think really carefully about the pluses and minuses of wastewater treatment plants. For instance, we could anaerobically digest New York City waste in their wastewater treatment plants, but that might increase the nitrogen loading to Long Island Sound, which might not be a good idea. So I want to really be careful and holistically thinking about that. And going back to the farm discussions of earlier, I guess I think it's a good idea to think about anaerobic digesters of manure. But in all cases, I think that should be used really close to the source generation. And I think we should recognize it's going to be a small source, which presumably your analysis will show. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Bob, for all of that. And I would say, you know, we are looking at exploring the opportunity space for all technology. And partly what we want to do with these scenarios is we have hypotheses that are important to test and to show, you know, what might be some of the limits of certain resource types. So we can, in a single analytic framework, lay them all out. And so that is part of the point of some of the proposed sensitivities, is to kind of clearly and explicitly show how certain assumptions are going to drive certain outcomes. And so, you know, with the case in point of hydrogen, you know, we would be, any accounting we will be doing, we will be looking at the full carbon footprint. And in the case, for example, as you mentioned, of, you know, if we wanted to potentially still have some combustion for heating, whether it be of hydrogen or something else, I think we've already shown through both last summer's analysis and through the test run that we're going to have a very small amount of that, even if we have any of it, right? We're going to have a system dominated by electrification. There just isn't, we don't have the allowable carbon footprint in 2050 to have much of it. And so that's partly what we're going to be exploring is, you know, what is that remainder? What could it be? And what are our degrees of freedom? And that's certainly what we'll be putting forward in a proposal for our scenario planning. Sarah, are you seeing anyone else? I'm trying to see if I can also see hands raised. I'm having trouble seeing hands through my interface.
I'll just say thanks for that, Carl. I appreciate your thoughts on that. I think you're right on. Thank you.
Yeah. I think you said Peter Iwanowitz.
Carl,
yeah.
Peter Iwanowitz, and I also see Donna DeCarolis with her hand raised.
Okay, great,
so
Peter.
Just ever briefly, because Bob Howard took the words right out of my mouth, I can't agree with that analysis more. I want to be associated with all of Bob's comments and Raya's about these things. I think the more that this is about, you know, full electrification of all of our systems by 2050, and you know, an analysis sort of says that, you know, in the outsized chance that we can't get there, you know, what are the issues and how do we get there? But just the way you sort of framed it up there, Carl, was the right way to think about it. And I'm really looking forward to the scenario that lays that out for us as a council. So thank you.
Okay. And then I think Donna.
Yeah, I guess I was just going to add, thanks, Carl, to you and the team. You know, I know everybody on this call, you know, many of us have different viewpoints. There's divergent viewpoints of the best pathways. There's lots of pathways. There's lots of studies that are being considered and emerging studies. And I guess I would just say thank you for considering all of these. And I do support the kind of broad scope of analysis that you're doing. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Donna. And I may be getting the hang of it. Am I saying Gil? Yeah.
Oh.
Hi. Thank you.
There you go.
I think Carl and team, you really have framed the analysis appropriately. One of the things that's going to be important for us to look is both the cumulative and interactive effects of all the policy recommendations. Just like to highlight, let's really look at reliability, which is how does our system perform under normal conditions, and the other concept, resiliency. How does our system perform under stressed or abnormal conditions, which we're having more and more as we have witnessed the past few weeks. There are other issues that are emergent, cyber and physical security. So let's just make sure that we're thinking about those items, talking to the New York ISO, New York State Reliability Council, the utilities, NPCC, which is our regional reliability part here in the Northeast. As we do our runs, let's just make sure that while we are achieving our climate goals, that we are keeping our system reliable and resilient for the future.
Yeah, great comments. And I think that echoes, I think, what we've heard from other council members, other meetings as well. So thank you for bringing those up. You know, we will have our traditional reliability objectives that will be built into the electricity system modeling. I think the resilience aspects, as we'll hear from some of my staff at future meetings, are ones that we're continuing to grow new metrics and new tools around. And so I absolutely agree that we need to be in a learning mode as we think about how we interrogate our scenarios and our solutions in the coming months, to think about, if we can't quantitatively capture all the resilience aspects, we at least have to qualitatively think about risks and think about how we manage those risks. So do fundamentally believe in exactly what you've said. And again, I think we have that actually maybe on the next slide, but some of the resilience aspects are something we've heard across all of our council members, and the shifts in the weather that we've seen only reinforce that. So maybe we've had a couple of good leading questions for the next slide. So Sarah, maybe I'll jump to the next one, unless you're seeing any of the burning hands. Okay. And then obviously what I hope to do is I want to bring up some more general input, and then I'll get into 2 slides which actually present our proposals, which reflect back what we've heard. And again, would love to have some more dialogue around those. So this slide became a bit of a catch-all. So many points that the council have raised to me and my team, and a number of the points of feedback we've heard from the Climate Justice Working Group pertain to issues, for example, surrounding distribution of investments or participatory processes. So not just what we do it, but and the policies to drive how, but whose voice is heard in those processes. We've also heard about calls for institutional innovation. A number of those points really can't be directly captured in system modeling, but they do need to be captured in the scope itself. And so what I wanted to do with this slide is partly document what I've heard from you all, which either call for us to maybe bring up some new analytic frameworks, but also just to put a pin in this virtual pad that says these are important points that we're hearing, and that our scoping plan authors, and as we work on the text, need to reflect it back. So the first one is partly getting to what we've heard from a number of folks. We've heard Paul bring it up today. We've heard from the Climate Working Group, Climate Justice Working Group, is a call for us to take a look at carbon pricing and look at it through different lenses. And so to look at it not just as a mechanism that could in itself reduce consumption through the elasticity of demand around certain high intensity products, but also so that's the behavioral change aspects, but also as a source of funding. And to look at carbon pricing in its more traditional structure as maybe a fee structure, but are there alternative ways of getting pricing done? And so we've heard this. We recognize that the tool set we have doesn't endogenously have this type of a behavioral lever. So what we're doing right now is we're working to see what new tools we can bring quickly to the table so that we can do at least a first level examination around carbon pricing. So I'm going to come back in October and I'll have a proposal of how we can complement the work that we already have underway with some carbon pricing analysis. And to be clear, there are a number of different ways you can fund the technology advancement that we are already modeling. And a carbon fee or other pricing structure could be one such mechanism. There are others that the advisory panels have brought forward. So this question lies not only in the analytics that we're doing, but also in the scoping plan itself and how it will address and talk about carbon pricing. So again, I'll be coming back in October to discuss how we can bring hopefully some new approaches. It may be at more of a screening level given the time we have, but I do want to explore and bring forward something new for you all. And then some of these other bullets I just want to highlight. So there's been a call for us to explore distributed energy research ownership options. Again, not explicitly something that would drive a scenario, but important for the scoping plan to explore, whether it be through community ownership models and also the utility ownership models that have put on the table over the years. Plan for distribution system upgrade costs. That's something we are explicitly looking at in the modeling, but it's certainly something that we have to take into account as we look at trade-offs within our scoping plan. Looking at reform of building codes and improved energy efficiency standards. The advisory panel has already put forward recommendations to adopt more advanced building codes and more advanced standards. It's certainly something to look at in the scoping plan, along with reductions of HFCs, which we've seen are a potentially very large source if they're not mitigated in the future. There's also a call for the examination of the role of state and local government in the advancement of climate solutions. As just one example, how can we leverage local government and its capacity to accelerate electrification for building space heating and cooling in public housing? So these are important recommendations which we're translating to the folks who are pulling together and synthesizing the advisory panel's input. There's also a call to elevate economic development as a pathway to achieve the CLCPA goals. I think that's consistent with the work that's embodied in the Climate Justice Working Group. And what we want to do there is not just look at it in a traditional way of promoting economic development, but how can it be used while at the same time promoting our community's self-determination. So something that is not just a top-down economic development scheme, but also looks to the community for the solution set. And so, this could include looking at economic development in preferred sites such as brownfields. As was just mentioned in our discussion, there's been a call by a number of council members to not lose sight of the resilience of our system, our energy systems, and our whole economy that are going to be based on this new system as it transitions. And we need to look at climate change and we need to look at adaptation. We can do that both explicitly in our modeling, where we are going to be looking at hotter climate and more air conditioning needs as the future. So we will not just be looking at the past air conditioning needs, we'll be looking at what are the future needs around that. And then there will be areas where we need to keep it to a qualitative exploration of our resilience. And then all materials, these last two bullets are more around the process and transparency. So all materials and input used to develop our scenarios should be made public and provided to the CAC. And then if the CAC has not received any insights or recommendations from working groups, advisory panels, or other studies, those should be made available. And so we can say that we've already shared and have a process of sharing the working group input, our advisory input. In terms of the actual scenario planning, I've already shown you all the reference case and our illustrative test case. What we will commit to this week, and what I've asked my team to do is with the publication of these slides, is to put on our resources page all of the key levers and drivers that we pulled for the scenarios that I've already shown you. And then in October, when we present new scenarios, at the same time, we will load up onto our reference, our resource page, a detail of not just the key input assumptions that are already on the website that we vetted with our advisory panels. Those were around performance and cost assumptions, but also very, very clear in a series of tables, what are the individual levers that are being pulled across each of the scenarios that will drive these changes. And so we won't probably have time at an individual meeting to walk through all the hundreds of levers, but we're going to transparently put them on our resources webpage so that both the council can see them, but also so that our public stakeholders can also see them. So with that, I'll pause. And again, I've got two more slides to actually maybe get to the heart of the presentation, which are the actual scenarios. We're just going to pause there and see if there's any input or if anyone wants to build. I know we've already touched on some of these, so we don't have to repeat those, but if there's anything else that we didn't hit.
Peter, is your
I see
hand?
Peter Iwana with his, yep.
Go ahead.
Looks like Peter just pulled his hand down. That might have been a legacy hand. Paul, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I just want to ask you, Carl, about the approaches in looking at carbon pricing as a tool, sort of related to, you know, the political resistance that exists with respect to various carbon pricing tools, carbon taxes, and so on. And whether you're looking carefully at, you know, there's just been a ton of work done on carbon pricing, looking at ways to enhance the palatability of carbon pricing approaches. You know, they have included, you know, returning all of the revenue to the community, intelligently returning disproportionately to frontline communities, returning revenue to individuals who are investing in, you know, sort of home scale investment in conversion of household heating and cooling systems and so on. Are you looking at the sort of full array of things that have been shown to work globally with respect to carbon pricing?
Yeah. So absolutely, as part of our scope of work that we're actively working right now is both a literature review so that we can, there's already folks who have actually done incredible meta-analysis on the carbon pricing mechanism. So we'll be going back to the primary sources as well. Washington State is a great example of some really active, there have been years of deliberation there and kind of nuances that have been brought forward. So we'll be looking at some of the primary documents and looking to bring on some help of folks who've actually been engaged in those processes, as well as look to the literature to see what type of meta-analysis we can pull forward. And again, I think we'll have lessons that will inform potentially how we analyze carbon fees and structures, but also equally will inform the narrative by which we bring forward. How do we frame the potential for this policy mechanism?
Good, thank you.
Raya Salter's hand as well as Donna DeCarolis and Dennis Elfenbeck.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you again, Carl. There's so much work that's going on here. And I actually, Paul Shepson just sort of touched on one of my questions. I was very interested to hear about the tools and the work on the carbon pricing. And I just want to iterate that I hope that when we look at what the impacts of various carbon pricing can or may be on our GHG emissions goals, that as part of that process and lit review that you're looking at, what does it look like for community-owned and community-driven projects to be sort of governing a part of that solution. So that's a comment there of what I hope is sort of that you, as you're doing the rounds with the lit review, that you make sure you look at examples of that. Another thing I wanted to reiterate, I know I mentioned it in our small group session, is really the need to have, is part of this general input, a way to think about how, as we are doing all this beneficial electrification, how can we ensure that the investment and build out of the distribution system is done in an equitable manner, that we have a pathway and a just framework for this. I know we've talked about this in previous meetings. The chair, who I believe is not with us today, our PSC chair said, we don't have this, this roadmap right now, but I just wanted to iterate and please have included in this input is that need for this equitable roadmap.
Great. Yeah, thank you for reinforcing that.
Actually, I would add, because I know this is an input and this may not necessarily fall into the analysis, but this and you did allude to it in your preamble, but this discussion of how to have those community-based inputs and oversight, on these different pieces.
Thank you. I think Sarah mentioned Donna and Dennis. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, just to follow up on some of the other comments. One is, I guess I would say that the utilities have have been at this meeting and presented. You know, I'm a member of the utilities as well. And of course, we worry about affordability, reliability, and resilience. And I know we've talked a lot about reliability and resilience. And I know now we're talking about, you know, carbon taxes. How are we going to analyze consumer bill impacts and energy affordability for consumers ultimately as we go through all this? I know it's on your list.
Yeah, so I think
so thank you.
It is, yeah, and you know we'll be looking at the overarching costs and benefits as part of our kind of standard benefit cost analysis that comes with each of the scenarios, and so we'll be able to see again what the incremental costs above business as usual policies in fossil fuel use. What we are exploring with the carbon pricing, because I think it is an intimate piece of that policy, is just that what would be, when we look at a potential fee structure, how would that ripple through the economy? And so for me, that's an important piece, and it requires different tools. Okay, Dennis?
Yeah, Carl, just general, because I'm trying to see how this all relates. It's just, we always, every time we announce a new program or a new order, we always say that we're creating thousands of jobs. Is any of the process that you're looking at, because to me, the recommendations that you're assessing, you're putting into an integration model tells us that there's certain activity that's coming that's going to align with certain technologies that will result in jobs. So how do we kind of look at what you're doing, or how do you see yourself or the role of your group in helping to be a little bit more clearer on these jobs being created? And I'd also add opportunity for supply chain development of green products and manufacturing in New York versus 95% being purchased outside of New York. Do you see that as a fit with what you're doing?
Yeah, so and I do, and in part it's because the law requires it of us. So the Just Transition Working Group has been specifically stood up to help inform the council around, as we look at different scenarios of this transition, where do we see the opportunity space for creation of jobs, and look at sensitivities around, as you say, you know, there would be at first cut, how much activity might you garner if you still imported the products, but you just had kind of direct jobs only happening? And then let's look at that concentric circle, get broader, and think about what if we can bring some of that supply chain, like with offshore wind, into the state. So our Just Transition Working Group is leading on that work, and we have a separate team. There's a separate consulting team that will be taking the integrated analysis as their input, and then analyzing the job creation and potential risks to existing infrastructure and existing job types that will come from this transition, so that we can empower our scoping plan to create a narrative that's inclusive, right? That looks for the opportunity space for supply chain growth, but also makes sure that everyone benefits. And if we see any risks in that space, how do we make sure that people aren't left behind? So there's an explicit job study that's being layered on top of this work. And that will come after we present those scenarios. First, you need to see the technologies, the costs and benefits. Then the Just Transition Working Group will digest some of that jobs analysis, and that will come in sequence after. And it is to say that just because we're presenting in sequence, we're not thinking of it as a line, right? We need to have kind of loops in our thinking. And if we see trends where certain scenarios and policy mechanisms drive towards a better transition, more job opportunities, less hardship, I think that needs to be then folded back into the narrative of the overall scoping plan.
Thanks, Carl.
Okay, I'm not seeing more hands at this point, so I'm going to move on. Next slide, please. But again, this is a dialogue. I tried not to have too many slides this time. If you're missing my large slide deck, don't worry, it's going to come in October. So just to kind of frame up our scenarios, so this is our proposed approach. It's reflecting back what we've heard from all of you. You know, what I'm trying to do with these slides, and we can go to the next slide so you can begin to read some of the material, is, you know, I'll present more details on my second slide, but this first slide really tries to provide an overview of our scenario planning to really emphasize what are the key mechanisms that will exist across all scenarios and all sensitivities, and then what are some of the key differentiating factors that we've heard from you that we should really try to explore. And I touched upon that earlier in some of my answers to some of the previous questions. And we hope that this, you know, helps to further our dialogue as we move forward. And so let me just break it down for you here, that what we see are some of the common themes, so kind of key assumptions across all mitigation scenarios. By definition, will we have a zero emission power grid by 2040? We do want to look at sensitivities, which I'll explain a little bit later around what that might look like. But that will be the foundation of our decarbonization because it's built into law. We will look at additional transit and vehicle miles of reduction. We already saw that the AP, that the Transportation Advisory Panel put forward some proposals around additional transit. We're going to go even further. And we're proposing to look at a couple different levels going beyond what the advisory panel brought forward. We're going to be looking at more rapid and widespread end-use electrification and efficiency. So again, that's for home heating, that's for transportation across all scenarios. We will be accelerating even faster than what we had from our advisory panels in order to hit our goals. We're going to be challenged to look at higher methane mitigation in agriculture and waste. What we saw from our test case is in 2050, a large portion of our residual emissions were in those sectors. And so we have to go deeper there. And then, as we've mentioned a couple of times already today, you know, we'll be looking at leaning into end-use electric load flexibility, which will be predicated on assumptions and testing different levers around end-use consumer engagement through different pricing mechanisms could be proposed and in other ways, as well as advanced technologies. So that can be through the form of new battery systems, new thermal energy storage systems. So we'll be looking at characterizing those technologies and embedding them across all of our scenarios. And again, what we hope to do with our sensitivities is look at higher and lower levels of adoption. So those are what we see are kind of truisms across all the sectors. And I hope what we see in that is it reflects back not just what we've read in the literature, what we've learned from turning the knobs on models over multiple years, what we've heard from our council members as you voiced your opinions, but also reflects back what we've heard from the Climate Justice Working Group, where we're looking across all sectors. We want to see higher levels of electrification and efficiency. We also want to see prioritization put on vehicle miles of travel reductions and transit-oriented development. We want to see an increased level of ambition, for example, in electrified transit buses. And we want to see scenarios that explore reduction in single occupancy vehicles. And as you'll see in the sensitivities, also explore different levels of investments in terms of rail. So for the core scenarios, what we're proposing are 3 different core scenarios. The first 2 will hit each of our limits, 40 by 30, 85 by 50. The first one will be a strategic use of low carbon fuels, including low levels of RNG and hydrogen combustion in our system. Again, built on a foundation of high electrification, because we're just not going to hit our goals if we can't have a high level of electrification. We want to juxtapose that against another scenario set, which is an accelerated transition away from all fuel combustion. And again, I think we've heard from the dialogue today, we've heard different council members putting forward an interest and need in seeing both of those. We've heard from the Climate Justice Working Group, there's a real strong desire to see a scenario and scenario family that minimizes or nearly reduces all combustion. And so that's what we want to be able to bring forward. Our third scenario that we want to explore reflects both the analytics and science that we're seeing and also a call for the fact that we might need to go beyond 85%. And so what are we finding in our analysis, as we saw in the test case, is that the carbon sinks, even as we push them hard, soil carbon uptake, afforestation in the state, we're going to be challenged to hit the full 15% of our carbon footprint in 2050. And if we can't find those natural and working land solutions, we're going to have to exceed 85%. And so we want to do through one scenario set is see where we can go further and deeper. What are the potential risks and opportunity space of going beyond 85%? We do think it will have to layer in elements of the previous two scenarios. And so those are the kind of the framing and the conceptual framework that we're bringing forward here. And then some of the areas of key sensitivities I've described before, but let me just walk through them quickly. As a matter of practice, we always look at a range of future fuel costs. It's uncertain what those fuels will cost us in, going out 30 years. Also, technology costs. There's uncertainty there, so we have to do bounds around those to understand for our cost-benefit analysis. What is the plus or minus range? We're also going to be looking at a scenario, or in this case, a sensitivity on our scenarios that look at what if we have new technologies that can be brought forward. We want to look at key sensitivities for our electric sector, which I'll unpack a little bit more in the next slide, and our transportation sensitivities. So examples of electric sector sensitivities are around our technology mix. We want to better understand where the land use impacts around our deployment, our large deployment of solar and wind, and where you might see limits there. We want to look at long duration storage. That's kind of a crossover from the innovation sensitivity, and what are some of the opportunities there. And then for transportation, as I mentioned a couple times, we're going to, across all scenarios, aggressively look at vehicle miles of travel reduction. We want to pressure test that even further. And we think if we go beyond 85%, we're going to have to get even more innovative around transit, potentially explore ideas which have been on the table for years, but have more limited implementation of, higher speed and better intercity rail. So we do think that in order to kind of get beyond 85%, we're going to have to push the envelope on some of those transportation options. We're going to look, as we've been asked to do, to look at different heat pump system configurations, to look at air source and ground source and some of the opportunity space of reducing peak load, look at district thermal systems where we might be able to have better cost effectiveness as well as reduce our peak. And then we also want to look at, as a sensitivity, what if we have a different assumption for the upstream emissions and the natural gas leakage, both higher and lower than what our kind of middle case has shown us? And what are the implications on our carbon footprint with those assumptions? What we've learned is the assumption around methane leakage upstream is incredibly important to the final solution set. And so when we arrive at these different scenarios, we want to be able to understand how sensitive are they to that assumption. So next slide, please. So with this one, I'm just unpacking, and this will be the kind of last for the afternoon, a little bit of what we mean by each of these scenarios. And so for the buildings and industry, when we think about strategic use of low carbon fuels, we're still looking at a backbone, a core of high electrification and widespread efficiency. There's no way that we're going to be able to heat our homes into the future if we don't do them with more efficient buildings. And so we'll be looking to exceed the levels that have been brought forward by our advisory panels. And typically, we look at we bin our efficiency into kind of best-in-class advancing codes, and then even looking as far as passive house construction. And there are going to be limits to the degree of the typology of buildings where you can implement that. But we are going to explore to what degree we can look at some really very efficient deep retrofits. But in that scenario planning, we're also going to look at a diversity of heating system configurations. And so we're going to look at the limited amount, and we have showed you before, and we'll show you in October again, how much renewable natural gas and other biofuels we think we can pull forward. And it is a small volume that we have to very strategically use if we're going to use it. And look at hydrogen combustion as well. Again, typically that would be in an industrial setting where we have, a particular need for a certain quality of heat, and we potentially see a hard to electrify end use. For transportation, we're going to, again, across all of them, have high levels of transit and smart growth. We're going to have to deeply electrify all of our transit across all scenarios. So in our strategic use of low carbon fuels, we're going to be looking at the inclusion of hydrogen, both for fuel cells and potentially for some limited combustion role, and for the role of biofuels, typically for the very long haul freight and for aviation fuels. And then in waste and agriculture, what we propose to do across all scenarios is increasing the capture rate of methane. And really what we want to test in our strategic use of low carbon fuels will be a higher reuse of that delivered methane that's captured from our waste streams for energy services versus a low reuse in our second scenario. So for our second scenario, we're going to, because we will not be able to have this strategic use of some of these low carbon fuels, we do see we're going to have to accelerate even faster our electrification. So not only will we have to electrify more end uses, but they will have to happen at a faster pace. And we have to look creatively at some of the opportunity space for the hard to electrify buildings. And that may be district thermal systems. And there still may be the use, and that's what we're going to pressure test to this scenario, is how can we get our combustion down to as close to zero as possible. Again, we may have certain specific industrial uses where we find that there's still a need for something like hydrogen. Similarly, in transportation, we're going to more aggressively look at accelerating electrification across all of our vehicle classes. We'll be looking even more heavily at a reliance on fuel cells, which are a zero combustion way of using hydrogen for some of those very hard to electrify through the battery systems, but we can electrify them through our fuel cell systems. And then stretch the limits of where we can hypothesize over aviation and how far can that go without either, without any use of biofuels. Maybe it's hydrogen, as we've seen in some of the proposals through some of the major airline companies, or even looking at substituting as we can for some of those air miles. So those are the digging a little bit deeper into two main pillars that we're proposing. And then to go beyond, we're going to try to combine levers that we're pulling from the previous two and go beyond 85%. And we anticipate that we're going to have to both accelerate, but likely have to use some low carbon fuels in order to go beyond 85%. So that may be more use of hydrogen in order to be able to go deeper. And then finally, around sensitivities, as I think I said at the last meeting, we're going to have a grid that's predicated on a substantial growth in wind, water, and sunlight. That's going to be the backbone of our electric system. We're also going to have demand flexibility and different levels of energy storage across all scenarios. But what we know is that we have both a call from our working groups and a call from you to test certain scenarios through our sensitivities. And so what we want to explore is, what if we have a moratorium on fossil fuel capacity, and what is the impact of that for our system? We've assumed that there's going to be a relicensing process, as we've seen in other parts of the country for our existing nuclear fleet. What happens if we don't have that relicensing of our fleet? We also want to look at scenarios that don't have any renewable gas combustion or hydrogen combustion in the power sector. And what does it mean to the system? And what are the opportunities to substitute for those? And then go further and look at a no combustion solution set. And what does that mean for the reliability and cost? It's really, in large part, as we've seen through some of these technical meetings, we'll have to lean into long duration seasonal storage and look at other technologies that will allow us to have that firm, clean capacity. So that's the full slate that we're putting before you. We think, again, it reflects back some of this dialogue that we've already had today and that we've had over the past few weeks. We hope it also reflects active listening to our Climate Justice Working Group and bringing forward some of the principles that they've been laying before you and that you've passed on to us. So with that, I'll pause and see if there's any further dialogue. Again, we've touched upon this already through the past hour, but I do want to create space for any other thoughts or any other reactions.
I see Bob Howard has his hand up.
Yeah, if I could. Thanks, Carl.
Please.
I really appreciate the fact, as I told you before, that you're going to do the sensitivity analysis for the upstream methane leakage. I think that's important. And I think all of your sensitivity analyses are well framed and important. So I'm really glad to see that. I'm still worried about how we're handling biofuels, because biofuels are so many different things. It's ethanol from corn, it's biodiesel from growing soybeans and other food crops, it's advanced biodiesel from wood waste products, and the consequences of using those are hugely different. So I think we need to get more into the weeds as to what we do and do not think we're going to do with biofuels, and we need to be doing that pretty soon. So I'd throw that out as my major concern. And I'd also just for fun like to throw out the idea, you mentioned that maybe we should be looking at greater rail transit. I love that idea. And I wonder if we should be thinking about, say for our top 3 or 5 or 12 upstate New York cities, if we should be investing in light rail systems like Portland, Oregon has at sort of the regional scale. What would that do for our greenhouse gas emissions? Is that cost effective? Is that something anyone's thinking about?
Yeah, so we are actively looking right now at the literature around those. You know, it's so place-based when you think about the specifics of land procurement, but it's something we are going to explore, even if it has to have some assumptions that are pulled out of where it's been successful elsewhere. But we are going to explore that so that we can, as you say, what's the marginal benefit from doing that? What's the marginal cost of doing that? What are lessons that we can learn how other people have been successful? And then on the biofuels, I hear you completely. You know, I think we had a really strong and great dialogue in the advisory panels last spring. And so we pulled forward that input where we heard from a number of technical experts, and we've done some of our own potential study work based on that. And so I will say that based on this, you know, we will make sure at the next meeting to have some specific time based on unpacking what those assumptions are. I think as we've alluded to, even as far back as last summer, we think, and it was reinforced by the advisory panels, there's really a very small amount of sustainable bioenergy. Much of it needs to be waste derived. We would not, for example, as you say, we would not predicate a scenario based on importing corn ethanol. You know, there's no precedent for that. That's kind of that's a pathway from any of the advisory panel members that they would want us to explore. So we will definitely commit to unpacking that. And what you'll see is it's going to reflect back largely what we heard at the advisory panels, but what we've done is we've coherently and consistently pulled together that input to have one set of potential studies that say this is the different feedstocks, this is how much energy we can get for them, and this is the cost of those.
That's great. Thank you.
Gil Quinones has his hand up.
Hi, thank you. Just one thing to add under the power sector sensitivities is, you know, Carl, where this was captured in the previous slide or other categories, but the grid itself, right? The transmission, subtransmission, and distribution will have to evolve because that will be the platform to enable a lot of the things that we're talking about here. So we should reach out to I know there's a utilities working group. We should reach out to them and to inform them, you know, how we should model that. Maybe we can rely on entities like the Electric Power Research Institute and some national labs who focus on grid transformation and modernization. And what are the basic things that need to happen so that that platform can support all of the things that we're talking about?
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think there's both, again, qualitative and quantitative recommendations that we need to harvest in terms of how we're going to shape the grid of the future. I will say that we've been, I'll put in a plug for them. We've been really pleased with the level of engagement from the utility working group. They really invested quite a bit of time last spring, giving us a substantial amount of feedback going into the modeling framework. And we will appreciate when we start putting out drafts, getting feedback from them as well. We've also been reaching out to some of the folks from the national labs to help inform our power grid study. And so we are leveraging that study itself because it offered us kind of a very rich and detailed look at what a zero emission grid could look like. But we've also reached into some of those national lab experts who've informed that study to help us shape our modeling.
Great. And let me know if you want to reach out to EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute.
Great.
They have some good work on that also. I just think the evolution of the grid is going to be critical because it can enable or it can stunt the development and evolution of what we're thinking about here. You know, we should really think of the grid as the platform that will enable a lot of this, and we need to invest in the grid, not just in the transmission. By the way, I got to give kudos to the state, and I know the Public Service Commission just issued an order to encourage utilities to do their transmission planning. But that really needs to go all the way down to sub-transmission and distribution system and at the edge of the grid, where a lot of these things are going to be connected. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Raya Salter?
Yes, thank you so much. I wanted to, I guess, just agree with earlier comments and express concern about the so-called low carbon fuels. Although I definitely heard you, and I'm looking forward to these more sort of discrete and specific proposals, analyses that are coming out so that we can actually really evaluate what's actually on the table. I also want to thank you, Mr. Quinones, for your comments about really the need for this beyond transmission planning into all the way out through the distribution system. And just reiterate, I think that's a fantastic plan. I'm glad that you're looking into that. Reiterate that we need this pathway for equitable investment and equitable planning as it relates to economic development and disadvantaged communities, and that may and we've got a lot of fantastic, NREL and others who've been thinking about that, but to be, but it's beyond the utility, specific universe of stakeholders who, have input on those types of ideas as well.
Great, thank you, Raya.
I'm not seeing any additional hands raised.
Okay. Well, thank you all for sticking with me for this long. I've really appreciated, my team has really appreciated all the feedback that you've given us. We've really been able to shape this proposal as an active dialogue. So again, thank you for that. And I look forward to coming back next month and sharing with you some of what we're finding. So thank you again. And I guess we go next slide.
Thank you, Carl. I think we can actually go one more slide. So this brings us to the end of what we had planned for our agenda today, but before we wrap, I want to just talk about some next steps and the work before the council through the end of the year. So it'll take a little bit of time to get through the modeling runs for the integration analysis scenarios that Carl's outlined here. But the intention is to come back to the council at the public meetings on October 1st and October 14th to review and discuss initially the draft results of the scenario modeling and then the revised results respectively on October 1st and then October 14th. And we'll also continue our engagement with the Climate Justice Working Group at those meetings. By late October, we aim to provide an initial draft of the scoping plan to council members, and then we'll be working the remainder of the year to get that ready for public release. So I think I've mentioned it before, but to mention again, late fall is going to likely be a very busy time for the council, but we will work with the council members to determine how to most efficiently get information exchanged and get prepared for the release. As you can see, especially with the modeling work, there's it can be very complicated, and there's a lot of different considerations to take into account, as we've heard here today too. But looking at the possible options through the scenarios that are going to be developed in the integration analysis, we think that this is going to help to provide really good context for resolution of some of these issues. And so with that, just wanted to also share publicly that as we prepare the draft scoping plan, we're looking at it as a document that will include the multiple scenarios that are outlined here and as they're refined over the next month or so. And that will include the full costs and benefits, showing essentially the different scenarios of how the state can achieve the emissions limits outlined in the Climate Act. And so while the draft scoping plan will have the multiple scenarios, just want to keep in mind that the council does have through December of 2022 to continue its discussions and to complete a final scoping plan. And that will also give us the benefit of having a full public input process on the scenarios. We can have continued conference with the Climate Justice Working Group, and as well as, you know, further opportunity to explore other technical issues that that may arise as we see more of the results of the scenario planning here. And so while the plan is going to lay out ultimately the final scoping plan will lay out a pathway, a single pathway to the CLCPA compliance, as well as the initiating actions to get that into place. The draft scoping plan will instead have basically all of the inputs, the advisory panel recommendations, the contributions of the Climate Justice Working Group, the outputs of the integration analysis, and just want folks to understand that that we still have time and space in 2022 to receive additional input and engagement on the scoping plan. And that was the extent I wanted to go into the next steps, but we do have a little bit of time. If there are any questions or comments from folks, happy to take them at this time as well. Bob Howard?
Yeah, Sarah, thank you. Two things. It's certainly easier for me to have the meetings remotely since I live 4 hours from Albany, but there's an advantage to being in person as well. What's the intent for the rest of these meetings? Will these be remote, do you think, or in person? How should I plan?
So I would say for now, we're intending the meetings to be virtual based on just the recent COVID statistics. I would say if anything changed dramatically and we saw improving numbers, there's certainly the possibility of us returning to in-person meetings. But for the time being, I think we're looking at them as being virtual meetings. Okay, thank you for that. And then also, you just addressed this. I might have drifted off at the wrong moment, but there's a scoping plan and then there's the implementation plan. Those are two different things, is that right? And the scoping plan will have a draft done by December. Well, actually, we're supposed to have an implementation plan done in December. Is that correct? The scoping plan leads up to that. Sorry if I misspoke. There's the scoping plan is the ultimate deliverable from the Climate Action Council here. So there's a draft scoping plan that is required to be issued by January 1st, 2022, and then the final scoping plan is required to be released a year later, so by January 1st of 2023. And so essentially the draft scoping plan that is under development now will include the multiple scenarios that will be included in the integration analysis, laying out the multiple pathways, and the final scoping plan is where the council will be ultimately kind of narrowing those scenarios down to a final pathway towards the CLCPA goals.
Okay, so the scoping plan is our final target. Draft form this year, final form a year from December.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
And then just in terms of, just to maybe say a little bit about implementation, after the final scoping plan, then the law requires DEC to issue formal regulations to, I guess, to make the climate action plan binding on the state to ensure that we meet the goals. So there's kind of once there's a final scoping plan, there's then another process of DEC regulations as well. Paul Shepson?
Yeah, since we have a few minutes left, and maybe I drifted off at the same time as Bob, but I think what I heard you say is that the initial draft certainly won't promote a single pathway, but rather will incorporate all the recommendations from the panels and enabling us in 2022 to discuss all of the potential pathways to meeting the goals. I'm just wondering if you and or the co-chairs or anyone else can comment on the process by which we will try to quantitatively assess the relative effectiveness of these pathways that have been formulated. How do you see that we're going to get from A to B here in, once they're laid out in the draft plan?
So,
tough question.
I'm putting, first of all, I think the integration analysis is going to be really important to informing the pathways, and I guess I would anticipate that we would see differences between the scenarios along multiple lines, including whether, the ability to achieve targets, the goals, and how realistic we think the assumptions are in order to get to those. So kind of the ability to reach the goals. I think job impacts, economic impacts will certainly be a lens through which the council might want to take a look at it. Equity, of course, the social justice piece of this, cost. There's going to be a number of different axes on which to evaluate these. Also the co-benefits and the impact, kind of that. And so I guess my personal thinking is to pull out several of those. Probably, the ones I've mentioned are probably the ones that at least come top of my mind as to the different axes against which the council should, be thinking about how they would down select or would kind of choose an optimal path forward. But certainly as we get to that stage, I would be more than happy to pull out some of those axes from the legislation and offer them up to the council as consideration. We certainly could take the approach of identifying evaluation criteria for the council to use if that was something of interest, but we could also keep it a little bit, less formal than that and have a variety, show the information, present the information of the various scenarios on, multiple axes and allow the council and the public to respond.
Yeah, I just want to comment how fascinating this challenge is, as you put it, in along multiple dimensional axes, that we're really going to need to do an analysis of the impacts in n-dimensional space. It's going to be an interesting challenge and one that, if we do it right, will have some historical value.
Yes, Paul, this is Doreen. I certainly would say I don't think it's going to get easier in 2022. In fact, I think, we're going to be able to look at some of the trade-offs. Certainly these scenarios will allow us to do so. But in the end, I have a feeling Carl and team will be brought to bear to look at some of those trade-offs analytically, breaking down some of the components even within the scenarios as we proceed. And I really don't want to discount. In fact, I want to build up the fact that this is subject to a robust public comment period. And that's really hugely critical as we advance through 2022. Is that it's going to be a great opportunity to hear from others to inform our next steps later in the year.
Thank you both.
Peter Iwanowitz?
So can we just underscore that last point that Doreen made, because I thought it was just spot on. I mean, we're going to be out there accepting public comment at no less than 6 public hearings, hopefully in person. Hopefully we're all together. on a dais listening to those comments because they're going to have a lot of input and a lot of valuable input. So just let's maybe begin the next meeting with that reminder, Doreen, because I think it's really, really important, particularly for all those who are participating but not, actively commenting, on webinars like they are today. So, and Sarah, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I just want to just go back to a point that I think that both Paul and Bob were getting at. It sounds like we're going to be presenting a couple of different scenarios or pathways, if you will, to the public. So unlike a broad comment period that exists around when we update the state energy plan, where you're kind of given a plan, you look at it, and then that's the plan, and then it goes final. We're going to present some pathways or different scenarios for people to then be commenting on as we developed what ultimately would be with that one scoping plan. Do I have that correct?
That's correct.
All right, thanks. So for those of you who aren't on the Climate Action Council or listening in from the attendees section, start preparing sort of to understand at the end of the year, you're going to see scenarios from us to comment on, not a one version of a plan to say yes or no on. So thanks, Sarah.
That's correct. Thank you, Peter. Donna DeCarolis?
Thanks, Sarah. Just another follow-up, and I think I heard you say something to the effect that there would be the plan would have initiating actions included. I think you said that. And if you did say that, could you tell me more about that? Thank you.
So initiating actions could be a couple different things. So I think of it as we have some, recommendations that might be around, well, I'll take power gen just because I'm a little bit more familiar with those. Say we have to examine the clean energy standard to make sure that we're hitting the targets and that we're achieving kind of the growth of large scale renewables that is basically on the path that we need to be. Some initiating actions under that could be suggesting that the Public Service Commission reopen a proceeding on the clean energy standard, or it could suggest, it could be other activities. The state should start, moving forward with incorporating environmental justice considerations into more of its planning and kind of explaining what that would look like. So it's really not anything, I wouldn't say new from what you've seen before, but it's just kind of the next layer of recommendations that are a little bit more about the actual action that needs to be taken. And so there will be some of that, as we saw from the panels, that is laid out or that we anticipate would be laid out in the draft scoping plan. And also keep in mind that there are going to be, although it'll be various scenarios, we will, there will be, as Carl said, recommendations that are common across all the scenarios. So it won't necessarily be, oh, we're doing this or we're not doing that. Some of them will just be baked into the scenarios across the board. And so there might be some implementing actions that are outlined that the state could actually, potentially make progress on prior to having a final scoping plan. Particularly, I would say, if those are kind of, maybe it's an overplayed term, but the no regrets strategies, the stuff that everybody agrees this must be done, we need to get it underway. There's no reason to wait.
Okay, very, very helpful. Thank you, Sarah.
Yep. Paul, I see your hand is up, but that might be a legacy hand. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any other hands. So with that, I will thank everybody for attending and stay tuned to our next Climate Action Council meeting that is scheduled for October 1st. I believe that one is a little bit of a different time. We've got that scheduled from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. For folks watching. So we'll look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Sarah.
Bye-bye.
Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.